There is a shot, near the end of the show's long run, where the camera pulls all the way back from the Land of Ooo, past the treehouse and the candy spires, and the little details you have grown to love, until you are looking at the whole planet hanging in space, and you can see that a huge piece of the world is simply gone, a crater bitten clean out of the earth, as if something took a single enormous mouthful and drifted off. That one image quietly rewrites everything you thought you were watching, because Ooo is not a fantasy kingdom in some faraway make-believe. Ooo is Earth, our Earth, roughly 1,000 years after we ruined it. And almost nobody watching as a kid understood that for years. Tonight we are going to walk the entire history of that world, from the comets that seeded life on it, to the war that ended it, to the long, strange childhood of the kingdoms that grew back out of the ash. So get comfortable, turn the lights down low, we will be here a while, and if you haven't subscribed yet, it really does help us keep making these. Let me start with the ground under everything, because Adventure Time is one of those rare shows that hides its biggest idea in plain sight, and then lets you take years to notice it. The setting is called the Land of Ooo. For most of the early episodes, it looks like exactly what a cartoon kingdom is supposed to look like. There is a hero with a sword, a wise princess, a wizard who steals princesses, a shape-shifting dog who talks, a candy city full of little living candy people. You do not question any of it, because the story does not want you to yet. It plays the surface completely straight, all bright color and silliness and adventure, and it lets that surface be enough for a long time. But the ground it is all standing on is a corpse. Ooo is what is left of the planet after human beings fought a global nuclear war, and it is called the Great Mushroom War, after the shape of the clouds those bombs make when they go off. Roughly 1,000 years pass between that war and the day Finn and Jake first walk on screen, and in those 1,000 years the ruined planet does not stay ruined. It changes. It mutates. Something never fully explained in scientific terms, something the writers simply call magic, comes flooding back into the world, and the survivors and the mutants and the strange new things that crawl up out of the wreckage slowly become the kingdoms of Ooo. I want to be careful here, because this is the single fact everything else in the history depends on, and it is easy to soften it into something cozier than it is. Ooo is not an alternate world. It is not another dimension. It is not a fairy tale planet that happens to resemble ours. It is the actual future of the actual Earth, and Adventure Time is quite deliberate about the clues. In the flashbacks to the years right after the war, when we see a much younger version of a character wandering the ruins, there is a highway sign in the background. A real one, the kind you would see on an American interstate, marking a route number and a direction. There are cracked overpasses and dead cars, and the bones of a civilization that used telephones and televisions and everything else we use. When the camera finally shows you the whole planet from orbit, the continents are deformed and warped from how you know them, pushed and pulled into new shapes, and there is that enormous chunk missing, a wound in the crust, attributed to the bomb that ended everything. A mutagenic weapon so violent, it did not just kill the people in the blast radius, but vaporized a piece of the planet itself. That crater is the plainest possible way of telling you, this happened here, this happened to us, this is not somewhere else. Now, the exact geography is one of those things I have to be honest about, because fans have argued over it for years, and no clean map is ever drawn. The highway signs and other clues point toward Ooo overlapping what used to be the Americas, the former Pacific Northwest, specifically for some of those post-war wanderings. But other pieces of evidence have sent viewers looking at Europe or Asia for where the Great Crater actually sits, and the creators seem happy to leave it a little blurry. So the responsible way to say it, the way that will not earn you a pile of angry corrections, is simply this. Ooo is a transformed Earth, its land masses rearranged, a giant piece of the planet gone, and the precise real-world coordinates are left deliberately vague. What matters is not the latitude. What matters is that when you watch a candy person waddle down a cobblestone street, you are watching something that grew, over 10 centuries, out of the place where we used to live. That is the melancholy that hums under everything, even at its silliest. Every adventure is happening on top of a graveyard, and most of the characters have no idea. And here is the thing that gets under my skin about it, in the best way. This premise could so easily have been used to be grim. Plenty of post-apocalyptic stories go that route, all rust and cruelty and despair. Adventure Time does almost the opposite. It looks at the ruined world and decides that an ending is also a beginning. that a poisoned planet can still be truly joyful, that the children born 1,000 years after the bombs deserve wonder just as much as we did. The sadness is always there, folded underneath, and we will spend a lot of tonight pulling it out into the light. But the basic emotional argument, the thing the series keeps coming back to, is that life comes back. Comets fall, wars end, and something new grows in the crater. To understand how deep that idea runs, we have to go back much further than the war. We have to go back to before there was any life on the planet at all, because this cartoon actually built itself a full cosmology, a deep history stretching back tens of millions of years, and it is far stranger and far more thought through than a story about a boy and his dog had any business being. So let us go back to the very beginning, to the comets. Adventure Time establishes, mostly in a single remarkable 6th-season episode called The Comet, that the Earth is visited on a regular schedule by what it names Catalyst Comets. These are not ordinary balls of ice and rock. Each one is described as an agent of change, a thing that arrives roughly once every 1,000 years and fundamentally alters the course of life on the planet, and they come in a sequence marked by color. The known order runs blue, then green, then yellow, then purple, and each color carried something different in it, something that reshaped the world when it struck. This is the mythology reaching for its highest register, the register where a children's cartoon turns into a creation myth, and I find it genuinely moving that anyone bothered to build it at all. The first comet, the blue one, brought life itself. Before it fell, the Earth was barren, an empty rock turning in the dark. The blue comet seeded it, and everything that ever crawled or swam or grew traces back to that first arrival. So the very existence of anything alive on the planet, including you and me, if you follow the logic all the way out, is owed to a rock that fell out of the sky in the unimaginably deep past. That is a lovely idea on its own, the notion that life is not native to the Earth, but delivered to it, a gift or an accident from somewhere else. But it is the second comet where the mythology turns dark, and where the roots of the greatest villain are planted, because the green comet did not bring life. The green comet brought evil, not evil as a metaphor, not evil as a bad mood, but evil as a literal substance, an incarnation of pure malevolence, with a real physical presence. When the green comet struck the Earth, it is implied to have caused the extinction event that wiped out the dinosaurs, the great dying of roughly 65 million years ago, and it deposited on the planet the essence that would eventually become the creature called the Lich. I will come back to the Lich again and again tonight because he is the closest thing Adventure Time has to a devil, but it is worth pausing on how his origin is framed, because it is so much bigger than the surface usually lets on. He is not just a powerful monster, he is connected, by implication, to a cosmic entity named GOLB, and to understand the Lich you eventually have to understand GOLB, and GOLB is where the whole cosmology tips over from mythology into something closer to cosmic horror. So let me hold the Lich for a moment and tell you about the thing behind him, the presence that sits at the top of the entire franchise's chain of monsters, the enemy not of any one character but of order itself. That entity is GOLB, spelled with letters that do not really form a pronounceable word, and it is introduced slowly, in glimpses, before finally landing at the center of the finale. GOLB is the embodiment of chaos, of entropy, of disorder itself, a being that exists in its own void dimension outside the ordinary universe, and everything about how it is presented is designed to make you uneasy rather than excited. It does not scheme, it does not want a kingdom, it is not evil the way a villain is evil, with plans and monologues. It is closer to a law of physics with a face, the tendency of all things to fall apart and dissolve into formlessness, given a body and a terrible calm. When GOLB finally appears fully, it is enormous and slow and almost serene, and the horror of it is not that it hates you, but that it does not need to. Things that come into its presence are broken down, unmade, reverted to their most basic components, digested back into raw essence. The series is a little careful about stating this as an absolute cosmic law, and I will be too, because the comics have handled it slightly differently, and the episodes keep the exact rules a little foggy. But the strong implication, the thing every image of GOLB is telling you, is that this is the force that erases, the anti-creation, the opposite of the blue comet that once brought life. If the blue comet was the universe saying, "Let there be something," GOLB is the universe saying, "Let there be nothing." And the tension between those two is, in a way, the entire spiritual spine of Adventure Time. And the Lich, the green comet's dark gift, is described as a piece of that. In the lore, he is called something like the last scholar of GOLB, an idea that reframes everything about him. He is not just a monster that happens to be strong. He is an emissary of oblivion, a fragment of that unmaking force wearing a body and walking around on the surface of the world. And his goal, stripped of all the specifics, is always the same. He wants everything to die. Not to be conquered, not to be ruled, but to be extinguished entirely. All life returned to the nothing it came from. That is why he is the true villain, even though he spends long stretches off-screen and defeated. Everyone else in Ooo wants something: love, or power, or safety, or a good sandwich. The Lich is the only one who wants absence. His soul, that green comet essence, was deposited on the earth in the deep past, and it waited, and it moved from body to body across the ages, a rot at the root of the world's history, which means that, when the dinosaurs died, the thing that would one day try to end Finn and Jake was already here, already ancient, already waiting for its next chance. Here is the detail about the Lich I find hardest to shake, and it connects the deep past directly to a face you know, because that same green comet, that same arrival of pure evil, is the event that a certain ice elemental saw coming and tried to stop, and his attempt to stop it created the single most important object in the entire series. To tell that story, I have to introduce you to a character most casual viewers have never heard of, a figure who appears in essentially one episode and yet turns out to be the hinge the whole thing swings on. His name is Urgence Evergreen, and if you only remember one piece of deep lore from tonight, this might be the one to keep, because it is the moment the ancient past reaches all the way forward and touches the saddest character in the story. Evergreen lived in the age of the dinosaurs, and he was an ice elemental, one of the powerful nature spirits scattered through the cosmology. The episode that tells his story imagines that era not as mindless reptiles in a swamp, but as a world with its own wizards and its own politics. Dinosaurs who could speak and scheme, elementals who commanded the forces of the planet. Evergreen learned that a comet was coming, the evil one, the green one, the one carrying the essence that would become the Lich, and he understood that its arrival would mean catastrophe, the end of his world. So he set out to build a weapon against it, and the weapon he built was a crown. Not a crown that shoots fire or summons armies. A crown with a stranger and more dangerous power than that. Evergreen's crown grants the deepest wish of whoever wears it. Whatever your most secret, most fundamental desire is, the crown reaches into you and tries to make it real. His plan was simple and desperate. He would put the crown on, and he would wish the comet out of the sky, wish it destroyed before it could fall, and save everything. But the crown never got to grant Evergreen's wish, and the way it went wrong is the seed of 1,000 years of sorrow. Evergreen had an assistant, a small put-upon penguin-like creature named Gunther, and in the chaos of the comet's approach, it was Gunther who ended up with the crown on his head, not the master. And the crown does what the crown does. It reached into Gunther and found his deepest wish, and his deepest wish was not survival, not power, not escape. His deepest wish was simply to be like his master, to be like Evergreen. So the crown granted it, in its twisted literal way, and it warped the little creature into a distorted, broken imitation of an ice elemental, a cracked mirror of Evergreen himself. The comet fell. The world of the dinosaurs ended, more or less on schedule. But the crown survived, buried in the changing world, carrying its curse forward through the ages, and that curse is precise and cruel. Whoever bonds with that crown does not simply gain ice powers. They are slowly turned into a warped version of Evergreen. The crown wants to remake its wearer in the image of the man who made it, and it does not care what that costs the person underneath. Now hold that in your mind, the crown that turns whoever wears it into a distorted echo of an ancient ice wizard, because we are going to leave it buried for tens of millions of years and pick it up again in the hands of a gentle, bespectacled museum man who only wanted to make his fiancée laugh. But first, look at what the writers have done here, because it is audacious for a children's cartoon. They took their most beloved sad character, a figure we will get to properly soon, and rooted his tragedy in the extinction of the dinosaurs. They connected the goofiest, most cartoonish villain of the early seasons to an ancient attempt to save the world from the devil. That is the kind of long-reaching, patient storytelling most shows never even attempt, and Adventure Time did it, while most adults assumed it was random nonsense. The randomness was always a disguise. Underneath it, somebody was keeping careful track of a history that ran from the birth of life to the far future, and every so often, they would let a thread of it show. Which brings us to the third comet, the yellow one, and a claim worth stating carefully because it is strange. The yellow Catalyst Comet, the third in the sequence, is the one tied to the birth of the human race, to the arrival of rational intelligence on the planet. And this is where a second deep-time entity enters the picture, because that yellow comet, the one that supposedly sparked humanity, was the target of a cosmic being trying to intercept it. That being is one of my favorite pieces of hidden lore in the whole run, because you have met him and you had no idea what you were looking at. He spends most of his time disguised as a penguin, but we will get there. The point for now is that the emergence of human beings is framed not as a slow accident of evolution, but as another catalyst event, another comet, another sudden change rung down on the world like a bell. Life, then evil, then us. 3 comets, 3 transformations, and a fourth one still waiting in the future that we will not reach until much later. A purple comet that carries something no one expects, tied to the soul of a boy who has not been born yet. I love that the mythology refuses to make humanity the center of itself. In most stories, the arrival of people is the whole point, the climax of creation. Here we are, the third comet, sandwiched between the coming of life and the coming of nothing. One more agent of change on a planet that has seen many and will see more. It is a humbling way to write us, and it sets up the great irony that hangs over the entire history of Ooo, which is that we, the yellow comet's gift, the rational intelligent species, are the ones who nearly ended the whole experiment with our own bombs. The comet brought us the intelligence, and we used the intelligence to build the Mushroom War. But that war is still a long way off in our story. Between the birth of humanity and the fall lie untold thousands of years of ordinary history, most of which we never see, because we do not need to. We only need the last little slice before the collapse, and that slice belongs to one man and the woman he loved, and to a crown that had been waiting tens of millions of years for exactly the kind of person he was. His name was Simon Petrikov, and before he was the Ice King, before he was a joke in a blue robe stealing princesses, he was a man. The writing is unusually specific about who he was, and the specificity is what makes his story unbearable once you understand it. Simon was an antiquarian, a scholar and collector of ancient and rare objects, the sort of gentle, bookish person who spends his life caring about things other people have forgotten. He was engaged to a woman named Betty Groff, and by every glimpse we get they were happy, ordinary, in love in the plain, warm way that real people are, with private jokes and small kindnesses, and a whole future they assumed they would get to have. And then, on one of his collecting trips in northern Scandinavia, Simon bought a crown from an old dock worker. Just an odd, ornate crown with 3 red gems set into it, the kind of curio an antiquarian would be drawn to. A strange, beautiful old thing with a story attached. He had no way of knowing what it actually was. He had no way of knowing that it was tens of millions of years old, that it had been forged by an ice elemental to fight a comet, that it carried a curse designed to swallow whoever wore it. To Simon, it was a treasure. To the crown, Simon was next. The way it lands hardest is that the first time Simon put the crown on, he did it to make Betty laugh. That is the whole tragedy in one gesture. He put it on his head as a bit of fun, a silly pose for the woman he loved, and the crown began its work immediately. It gave him power over ice and snow, and it gave him something like immortality, a body that would not age or die in any normal way, and in exchange it began, slowly at first and then faster, to take his mind. The crown erased him. It ate his memories, one by one, and it ate his reason along with them, and it started reshaping his personality into the cracked echo of evergreen it had been trying to make of every wearer since the age of the dinosaurs. Simon could feel it happening. That is the detail I cannot get past. He was not oblivious. He knew, in his good moments, that something was consuming him from the inside, that the man Betty loved was being scraped out of his own skull, and he was terrified. And he kept the crown near anyway because he had already started to need what it gave him, and because in the moments when the cold got into his thoughts he could not remember why he should be afraid. Betty watched it happen too, and this is where the pre-war part of the story ends in heartbreak rather than fire. She saw the man she was going to marry disappear into something else, someone who did not always know her, who would slip from lucid grief into raving strangeness and back, and eventually she could not stay. In the earliest version of events we get, glimpsed in old recordings and flashbacks, Betty leaves. She cannot watch it anymore, or she cannot reach him anymore, and she goes. And the loss of her, the loss of the one person who tethered him to who he had been, accelerates everything. With Betty gone, there is less and less reason for Simon to fight the crown, less and less of Simon left to do the fighting, and the cold comes in the rest of the way over the years that follow. Now, I am being careful with the sequence here, because Simon and Betty's story comes out in pieces across many episodes, and even gets revised and deepened in the later specials. And I do not want to hand you a tidy timeline. The series itself keeps a little fluid. What is solid, what you can hold on to, is the shape of it. A kind man bought a cursed object, put it on to make his love laugh, and it took his mind and drove her away, and that happened before the world ended, which means Simon's personal apocalypse and the world's apocalypse were running toward each other at the same time. Because the world was ending too. This is roughly the era, the last years before the fall, when the Great Mushroom War was gathering, and one more strange idea gets planted into this pre-war period, an idea that ties the magic of Ooo back to the bombs that made it. Magic, we are told, was not always loose in the world. In the age of ordinary human civilization, the age of highways and museums and engagement rings, it was largely gone, sleeping, buried under the concrete and the science. But as the war approached, magic began to return, to seep back up into the world, and the creator has said in interviews that it was the war itself, the nuclear devastation, that unearthed it, that cracked the world open and let the old forces back in. So the crown working on Simon, at exactly this moment, is not a coincidence in the logic of the story. It is part of a larger reawakening. The deep, buried, elemental strangeness of the planet was stirring again, right when humanity was about to blow itself apart, as if the two things were connected, as if the world could only become magic again by first becoming a graveyard. There is an object worth pausing on here too, because it belongs to this ancient and pre-war layer, and it will matter later. There is a book called the Enchiridion, an ancient hero's handbook that Finn and Jake dig up early in the first season, in an episode simply called the Enchiridion. On its surface, it is a guide for heroes, full of advice and challenges, the kind of magical instruction manual a young adventurer dreams about, but it slowly turns out to be far more dangerous than a self-help book for warriors. It holds real power. One of its gems is tied to the source of the Ice King's ice magic, linking the book back to the crown's world, and more alarmingly, the Enchiridion can tear open portals across the multiverse, which is exactly why the Lich, later on, wants it so badly. A thing that can open doors between worlds is a weapon in the hands of a being that wants all worlds to end, and Finn eventually has to destroy one of its gems, petrify it, to keep that power out of the Lich's reach. I mention it now because it is one of those objects that feels like set dressing when you first meet it, and turns out to be load-bearing. Ooo is full of those. Half the junk in the treehouse is secretly a piece of cosmic machinery. But let me come back to Simon, because I do not want to leave him as a case study. The reason his story is the emotional foundation of the whole thing, the reason the writers keep returning to it, is that it takes a thoroughly conventional cartoon villain, the wizard who steals princesses, and reveals that his villainy is grief and illness wearing a costume. When you first meet the Ice King in the early episodes, he is a punchline. He is petty and ridiculous and vaguely creepy, obsessed with capturing princesses to marry, defeated every week, comic relief with a beard. And you get to laugh at him for a long time before the lights come up and you see what you have actually been laughing at, which is a man with dementia, a man who was kind and is now cruel not because he chose to be, but because a disease took his self away one piece at a time. Once you know that Simon is under there, once you know he used to be a person who loved someone, the Ice King stops being funny in the same way. Every time he babbles about princesses, you hear the ghost of a man reaching for a woman he can no longer remember he lost. That is some of the most humane writing in any children's show. The decision to make the villain a portrait of memory loss, and to make his cure and his suffering the emotional through line of 10 seasons. There is a particular episode I have to mention here, because it is where a lot of us first felt the floor drop out. Early on, in a pair of holiday episodes from the 3rd season, Finn and Jake come across a box of the Ice King's old home videos, tapes he recorded of himself, and they sit down to watch them, expecting to laugh at the ridiculous wizard. What they find instead is footage of a man named Simon Petrikov, before the beard and the madness, a gentle bespectacled scholar recording himself as the crown slowly takes him, narrating his own disappearance, speaking to a fiancée named Betty who is not there anymore. It is the moment the joke stops being a joke. And the cruelest touch, the one that tells you exactly how careful the writing is that the Ice King himself is right there watching those tapes with the boys and does not recognize the man in them. He is looking at his own face, his own lost life, and the only thing he manages to feel is a vague embarrassment that he used to wear glasses. He cannot even mourn himself, because the crown took the part of him that would have known to grieve. And it means that when we cross over into the war itself, into the actual collapse of the human world, we are not crossing over with a stranger, we are crossing over with Simon, because he is the one character who lives through it. Almost everyone who existed before the Mushroom War is gone, vaporized or mutated, or dead of old age 1,000 times over. But Simon, cursed with the crown's terrible immortality, does not get to die. He survives the war. He survives the fallout. He walks out of the ruin with his mind half-eaten and his heart still, somewhere down there, intact. And what he does with that survival is the bridge between the old human world and the new world of Ooo. He becomes, without meaning to, and without even being able to remember it afterward, the guardian of the future. But to understand that, we have to actually go through the war, and the war is the hinge of the whole history, the event that turns the Earth we know into the Land of Ooo. So let me slow down and take it seriously, even though it mostly reaches us in fragments and flashes rather than one great sequence. The Great Mushroom War was a global nuclear war, and the name is exactly as literal as it sounds. Mushroom, for the mushroom clouds that rise off a nuclear detonation, that towering pillar of fire and dust, a whole generation of real people on our own timeline learned to fear. It sits roughly 1,000 years before the present of Finn and Jake. And honestly, the precise year is not something to trust from anyone who quotes it, because the specific figures that float around online are fan calculations built out of a single offhand line about how many years had passed, not numbers ever put firmly on screen. So we say roughly 1,000 years, and we leave it there. What is clear is the scale and the character of the thing. This was not a limited exchange, not a single bomb, not a contained tragedy. It was an all-out global war that ended in humanity turning its full arsenal on itself, an apocalypse in the oldest sense of the word, an unveiling and an ending both at once. And at the center of it, at the very end, was a weapon called the mushroom bomb, and this is where the war stops being an ordinary nuclear war and becomes something stranger. The mushroom bomb was a doomsday weapon, a mutagenic device, something with implied magical properties layered on top of its raw destructive power. It did not merely explode, it transformed. This is the weapon tied to that enormous crater bitten out of the planet, the one you can see from space, because the bomb vaporized the entire affected area, not just leveling it, but removing it, taking a piece of the Earth out of existence. And its radiation did not simply kill, it mutated. The people caught in the fallout who did not die outright were warped into mindless, shambling creatures, remembered as the Ooze people, victims of the mushroom bomb, reduced to something barely alive and no longer human. That mutagenic quality is the hinge that turns a dead planet into a living, magical one, because the same forces that unmade the old world seeded the new. The bomb that ended humanity is implicated in the return of magic, in the rise of the new races, in the whole impossible garden that grows out of the wreckage over the next 1,000 years. And it is here, near the end of the war, that the Lich takes physical form for the first time. Remember that his essence, the green comet's evil, had been on the planet for millions of years, moving from vessel to vessel, waiting. The war was exactly the kind of moment it was waiting for. As the world drowned in mutagenic waste, the Lich's essence found a body, possessing a being submerged in that toxic sludge, and took shape as the creature we know, all bone and green flame and hunger for nothing. There is a horrible fittingness to that, the embodiment of death and unmaking crawling up out of the exact moment humanity chose to unmake itself. It is as if the war summoned him, as if all that death called its natural king into the world. Nothing ever quite says humanity created the Lich, but it lets you feel the resonance, the sense that the appetite for annihilation that built the bombs and the ancient cosmic appetite that is the Lich are the same appetite, meeting at last in the ruins. I said I wanted to take the war seriously, and here is the reading I keep coming back to. Adventure Time was made, underneath the candy and the swords, by people who grew up in the long shadow of nuclear war, and it is doing something quietly radical with that fear. It refuses to look away from the worst thing human beings ever built, the actual capacity to end the world, and it also refuses to let that be where the story stops. Most post-apocalyptic fiction uses the nuclear war as a source of horror and leaves it there, or uses it to argue that human nature is rotten and doomed. This one looks at the mushroom clouds, looks at the vaporized continent and the mutant ooze people, and the near total extinction of our species, and then it says, and then 1,000 years passed, and there were candy people, and there was a boy who wanted to help everyone, and there was so much joy. That is not naivety. The sadness is right there, load-bearing, in every flashback. It is a choice. It is the insistence that even the ruin of humanity is not the ruin of everything, that life is more stubborn than our worst weapons, that the planet keeps going and makes something new, and that the something new is worth loving. I find that one of the braver artistic decisions in modern animation, and it is why all the silliness never feels hollow. The silliness is earned. It grew out of a graveyard on purpose. The immediate aftermath of the war is near total ruin. Humanity is almost completely wiped out, reduced to scattered tribes, a handful of survivors clinging on in a poisoned and rearranged world. The continents themselves are deformed, pushed into new shapes by the violence of it, that giant crater blasted into the crust. And into this wasteland walks Simon Petrikov, or what is left of him, the crown having carried him through the fire that killed almost everyone else. This is the moment the series returns to over and over, in some of its most beloved and most devastating episodes, because it is the moment the old world hands off to the new. Simon, half mad, immortal, alone in the ruins of everything he knew, wandering a dead landscape under a poisoned sky, and in that landscape he finds a child. I am going to hold the full weight of that meeting for the next stretch, because the child he finds is one of the characters the whole series rests on, and she deserves her own telling. But let me mark the handoff clearly, because it is easy to miss how much depends on it. The bridge between the human world that died and the land of Ooo that grew is not a kingdom or an army or a great institution. It is one broken man and one orphaned little girl walking through the rubble together. The entire warmth of Ooo, in a sense, starts there, in the worst place imaginable, with the least likely pair. That is the thesis about history in miniature. The future is not built by the powerful in the aftermath of catastrophe. It is built by whoever is left, holding on to whoever they can, refusing to let the last small good thing die. Before we follow them, let me lay out what the world becomes over the long centuries that follow, so you can see the shape of the 1,000 years between the war and the present. Because the war does not lead directly to Finn and Jake. There are 10 centuries in between, and those centuries are their own vast history, mostly unshown but heavily implied, in which the mutated survivors and the returning magic slowly organize themselves into the kingdoms we know. New races evolve, or are transformed, out of the aftermath. Ordinary things become people. Candy becomes the candy people. The elements themselves take on rulers. Vampires rise. A demon dimension makes itself felt. Somewhere in there, a mass of living bubblegum gives birth to a princess who will build a kingdom, and a hero named Billy walks the land doing great deeds. And the humans who survived make a decision that shapes everything, which is that they cannot stay. And through all of it, in the background, the immortal cursed man who found a little girl in the rubble is slowly, year by year, forgetting that any of it ever happened to him, becoming the Ice King, the way a shoreline becomes sand, not all at once, but by the patient erosion of everything he used to be. That is the tragedy running underneath the entire middle of the history, and it is worth naming before we go on. Simon does not get to die, and he does not get to remember. He gets the worst of both, 1,000 years of life with almost none of himself inside it, a mind that keeps resetting to a lonelier and stranger place. The people of Ooo who meet the Ice King in the present have no idea that this ridiculous wizard is older than every kingdom, that he walked out of the collapse of the world, that he raised for a little while, in the ashes, the girl who would become their vampire queen. History in Ooo is like that everywhere you look. It is buried in plain sight, walking around wearing a joke, waiting for someone to care enough to dig. So let us dig. Let us go back to the ruins and meet the child. The child is Marceline. You know her from the present as the Vampire Queen, a floating red-booted rocker with a bass guitar and 1,000 years of attitude, one of the coolest characters the series ever put on screen. But right after the war, she is a small girl, alone, human enough to be fragile, wandering the same poisoned ruins Simon is wandering. Her own origins are their own tangle of lore, and they matter, so let me lay them out plainly. She is not fully human. She is half human and half demon, the daughter of a human mother and of Hunson Abadir, a deathless demon who rules a dimension called the Nightosphere. Her connection to the Nightosphere and to her father is one of the running threads of her character, a source of both power and pain, and she is old, more than 1,000 years old, which is how a child from the years right after the Mushroom War can be a young adult in the present. Marceline has been alive for essentially the entire history of Ooo. She is one of the very few beings who remembers the old world at all. When we finally get to see the years right after the war, in a pair of episodes fans cherish above almost any others, we watch Simon and Marceline together, and it is almost unbearably tender. Simon, at this point, is not yet fully the Ice King. He is somewhere in the long middle of his transformation, a man who is still mostly himself, but who keeps slipping, keeps feeling the cold thoughts come and go, keeps losing the thread of who he is. And he finds this orphaned little girl in the wreckage, and instead of leaving her, which would have been so much easier, he takes care of her. He protects her. He uses the crown's ice magic, the very thing that is killing his mind, to fight off the monsters and mutants that would have hurt her, spending himself, letting the crown take more of him, to keep her safe. He scrounges for her. He tries to keep her spirits up in a dead world. And at some point he gives her a stuffed toy, a little gray bear she names Hambo, and that toy becomes the most precious object in her entire long life, because it is the physical proof that once, at the very beginning, when everything was ash, somebody loved her enough to find her something soft to hold. The cruelty of it, the thing you are not spared, is that Simon knows he is disappearing even while he is being the best version of himself. He can feel the crown eating him, and he can feel that the more he uses it to protect Marceline, the faster it takes him. And he does it anyway, and he knows that eventually he will not remember her at all. There is a moment, and I have to paraphrase rather than quote, because the exact wording matters and I would rather not mangle it, where he tries to make her understand that the ranting, cackling ice thing she sometimes sees him become is not really him, that the real him loves her, that she should not be afraid of the part of him being replaced. He is asking a child to forgive him in advance for the monster he is turning into, and she does. She holds on to the real Simon in her memory, even as he loses himself, and she carries that memory for 1,000 years, long after he has completely forgotten her, long after he has become the Ice King who does not know her name. That is the engine of one of the series' most famous episodes, the one where the grown Marceline visits the present-day Ice King, who is completely gone, completely lost in his own babbling madness, and she sings to him, trying to reach the Simon buried underneath. And the tragedy of the scene is that he cannot come out. He is too far gone. He picks up a page she wrote, an old apology of his own that she has kept, and he almost surfaces, and then he slips back under, and she is left singing to a man who saved her life and no longer knows she exists. I think that is one of the most emotionally devastating scenes in the history of children's animation, and it lands so hard entirely because of the groundwork, because we know the whole history behind it. Because we know this ridiculous princess-stealing wizard once carried this woman through the collapse of the world. The grief was earned across dozens of episodes, and it never once cheated for it. What strikes me about placing this relationship at the foundation of the post-war world is the choice it represents. The origin could have been built out of kings and battles and the founding of nations. Instead, it is built out of a sick old man and a lonely little girl and a stuffed bear. It decides that the thing that mattered most in the aftermath of the apocalypse was an act of care between two people who had nothing, that the future of the world was seeded not by conquest but by tenderness in a ruin. Marceline survives because Simon chose to love her when it cost him everything, and she goes on to become one of the great figures of Ooo. So in a real sense, the whole warm, strange world we love owes its existence to that choice. That is a statement about what history is actually made of, and it is not the thing the history books usually record. Eventually, though, the two of them are separated. There is no one clean scene of goodbye, more an understanding that the crown finished its work, that Simon at last became the Ice King fully and lost her completely, and that Marceline had to go on without him, a child who lost the only parent figure she had in the ruins twice over, once when he forgot her, and once when she had to walk away from what he had become. What follows for her is a very long life, more than 1,000 years of it, and it is not a gentle one. Her human mother, the one who once sang to her, is gone. Her demon father, Hunson Abadir, is a complicated and often absent presence, a ruler of the underworld who values power and deals over the ordinary business of raising a daughter, and there is old hurt between them, the sense of a child who felt abandoned by a father who could have been there and was not. So Marceline grows up, across centuries, largely on her own, in a broken world, carrying a stuffed bear and the memory of a man who forgot her. It is not surprising that she becomes guarded and sharp and hard to reach. What is surprising is how much love she still has in her under all that armor. She is proof that you can go through the worst of it and still come out the other side capable of caring for people. And she is going to need all of it, because her story is about to turn into monsters, into a curse of her own, into the thing that makes her the vampire queen, and that is a whole chapter of the history in its own right. But before I follow Marceline into her vampire years, hold on to one image, because it is the thread that ties this whole middle section together. A stuffed bear named Hambo. That toy is going to come back much later, when the grown Marceline loses it, and a certain candy princess goes to enormous, quiet lengths to get it back for her. And that act of getting it back is one of the clearest early signs that these two women love each other. So keep the bear in mind. In a story this large, with a history this deep, the objects are how the emotion travels across the centuries. A crown carries a curse from the dinosaurs to the present. A stuffed bear carries 1,000 years of love from the ruins of the war to a quiet moment between two friends who are more than friends. Adventure Time is always doing this, always threading its enormous timeline through small-held things, and once you start noticing it, you cannot stop. So let us follow Marceline into the long centuries and find out how she became the vampire queen, because it is not the origin most people assume. She was not born a vampire. She became one, and how she became one is the subject of an 8-part miniseries from the 7th season, a run of episodes usually gathered under the title Stakes, and it is some of the richest lore ever produced about a single character. What it reveals is that at one point, as a young woman in the wilderness of post-war Ooo, Marceline was a vampire hunter. A hunter, not the hunted. There were vampires loose in the world, a whole coven of them, led by a figure called the Vampire King, and Marceline made it her business to kill them, one by one, in a sequence framed almost like folklore, each vampire a distinct monster with a distinct power. And at the end of that hunt, she faced the Vampire King himself, and she staked him, killed him, and in doing so she absorbed his essence, took the vampirism into herself. That is how she became what she is. She became the vampire queen, by defeating vampires, by taking their curse into her own body as the price of destroying theirs. The powers of the coven she hunted, their various abilities, became hers. There is a beautiful, sad symmetry in that, very much in keeping with how the writing thinks about identity. Marceline did not choose to be a monster. She became a monster, in the act of protecting people from monsters, and then she had to live with being the thing she had hunted. The whole Stakes miniseries is, at its core, about her trying to figure out whether she can get rid of it, whether she can be cured, whether she can stop being a vampire and go back to being just Marceline. And in a move I really admire, it lets her try. She actually gets cured partway through, has the vampirism drawn out of her, becomes mortal again, and she discovers that being cured is not the clean relief she imagined, that her vampire nature and her long life are tangled up in who she is, in ways she cannot simply subtract, and that the vampires she thought she had destroyed come pouring back out of her when the curse is drawn off, so that curing herself unleashes the very monsters again. By the end, she chooses to take the vampirism back, to be the vampire queen again, not because she is forced to, but because she decides this is who she is, that she would rather be herself, monster and all, than a diminished version that pretends the last 1,000 years did not happen. It is a genuinely mature thing to put in a cartoon, the idea that you cannot cut away the painful parts of your history without cutting away yourself. That miniseries is also where we get the song that, for a lot of viewers, is the emotional key to Marceline's entire character. It is called Everything Stays, and it is sung, in flashback, by Marceline's human mother to Marceline as a small child, in the same ruins after the war we were just in. The mother is a figure kept deliberately faint. We see her, we hear her sing, but the series is careful about how much it tells us, and I will keep it vague too, because some of the specifics that circulate about her, including a first name you will find on secondary fan sites, are not things the main series firmly confirms, and I would rather leave her a little mysterious than hand you a name that was never nailed down. What matters is the song, and the song is a lullaby about change, about how things stay the same and also slowly become different, how the things you love shift by small degrees until they are something else, but a piece of them is still there underneath. And when you hear a mother sing that to a little girl who is going to live for more than 1,000 years, who is going to watch everyone she loves change and be lost and come back different, it stops being a nursery rhyme and becomes almost a prophecy. Everything stays, but it still changes. That is Marceline's whole life in a sentence. That is, honestly, the whole thing in a sentence. Marceline might be the character who best embodies what Adventure Time actually is, because she carries more history in her body than almost anyone. She is old enough to remember the world before Ooo was fully Ooo. She loved Simon and lost him to the crown. She lost her mother. She had a difficult father in another dimension. She became a monster to fight monsters, and then made peace with being one. She has watched kingdoms rise, and friends age and die, effectively immortal in a world that is not, and instead of becoming bitter and closed, which would have been the easy way to write her, she becomes an artist. She writes songs. She plays a bass guitar made from her family's ancestral battle axe, an heirloom weapon refashioned into an instrument, which is such a perfect object for her. Violence turned into music. The past turned into art. That axe bass is another one of those objects the story threads its history through, a family weapon that a girl who became a monster in the wilderness turned into the tool she uses to say how she feels. I love that the answer to 1,000 years of grief here is not vengeance or despair, but a girl with a guitar working out her pain in 3 chords in a cave. Now, there is a real-world layer to Marceline worth mentioning, stated neutrally, because it is documented and it is lovely. Marceline is voiced by Olivia Olson, and her father in the story, Hunson Abadir, the demon lord of the Nightosphere, is voiced by Martin Olson, who is Olivia Olson's actual father in real life. So the fraught, complicated, love and hurt tangled relationship between Marceline and her demon dad is played, in the recording booth, by a real father and daughter. I do not want to overread that, and I will not pretend to know anything about their private lives, but as a piece of craft it adds a texture to those scenes you can feel even before you know the fact. When Marceline and Hunson are circling each other, there is a lived-in quality to it, and part of that is 2 people who have known each other their whole lives finding a version of their own bond. It is the kind of small documented detail that makes the enormous mythology feel handmade, made by specific people who put pieces of themselves into it. Marceline's story keeps intersecting the larger history at almost every point, which is why I have spent so long with her. She is connected to the pre-war world through Simon. She is connected to the deep cosmology through the Nightosphere and her demon heritage. She is connected to the founding of the kingdoms through her long friendship, and more than friendship, with the woman who built the Candy Kingdom. And she is connected to the very end, to the finale, in ways we will get to. If you wanted to tell the whole story of Ooo through a single pair of eyes, hers would be the eyes to use, because she was there for almost all of it and she remembers. Everyone else either died or was born too late, or, in Simon's case, forgot. Marceline is the one who kept the thread. So when we talk about the history of the land, we are in large part talking about the things she lived through, and the friends she made along the way, and the greatest of those friendships, the one that shaped the central kingdom of the whole world, belongs to a princess made of candy, who was also, in her own way, a survivor of the aftermath, building a home out of the wreckage. It is time to meet her, and to understand that the sweetest-looking kingdom in Ooo has one of the darker and more complicated origin stories of them all. Princess Bubblegum, whose real name is Bonnibel, is not, despite appearances, a fairy tale princess. She is made of sentient candy biomass, living gum, a body she can deform and stretch and regenerate, and even adjust in apparent age, which is why she can look like a young woman of about 18, while being, by any honest accounting, ancient. Her exact age is one of those things left deliberately unfixed, and I want to flag that clearly, because you will see figures like 800 thrown around as if they were canon, and they are really fan estimates rather than a line from the series. What is solid is that she is centuries old, effectively ageless, and that she has been the ruler and the scientist and the mother figure of the Candy Kingdom for a very long time. She is one of the smartest beings in Ooo, a genuine scientist, forever in a lab coat over her gown, running experiments, building machines, engineering life. And she is, in the cosmology, the candy elemental, one of the 4 elemental forces given a person. The embodiment of candy, the way Flame Princess is the embodiment of fire. That piece of lore reframes her entirely once you know it. She is not a person who happens to rule candy people. She is candy, at an elemental level, the principle of sweetness made flesh, which is a strange and lonely thing to be. Her origin reaches back, like almost everything, to the aftermath of the war, and it starts with something called mother gum. Mother gum was a mass of mutated bubble gum, a great pink biomass that arose in the ruined world roughly 1,000 years ago, and out of that mass came the first candy life, including Bonoball herself and the being she thinks of as her brother, a gentle creature named Nettie, and the candy people more broadly. So bubblegum, like Marceline, like Simon, is a child of the aftermath, a thing that grew out of the mutagenic wreckage the Mushroom War left behind. She was not created by a loving parent. She emerged, alone, from a heap of living gum in a wasteland, a conscious being with no one to raise her, and she had to figure out existence from scratch. And that is where one of the more unsettling backstory episodes comes in, from the 9th season, one that finally shows us the young Bonoball in the empty world and what she did to cope with being alone. What she did was make herself a family. Being made of candy and being brilliant even as a child, she reached into the biomass she came from and she built relatives, pulling out and shaping other candy beings to be her people, her kin, so she would not be alone in the wasteland. She made an uncle, Gumbald. She made an aunt, Lolly. She made a cousin, Chicle. She built herself a household out of gum because the alternative was solitude in a dead world, and there is something heartbreaking in that image. A lonely child literally manufacturing a family because none was given to her. But it went wrong, in the way that making people who did not ask to be made tends to go wrong. Her uncle Gumbald grew ambitious and resentful and tyrannical. He wanted power, wanted to rule, chafed against Bonoball, and eventually he decided to get rid of her. His plan involved a substance called dum-dum juice, a formula that would strip a candy being of its intelligence and reduce it to a mindless, simple thing. Gumbald meant to dose Bonoball with it, to turn his own niece into a witless puddle so he could take over. And in the struggle, in self-defense, she turned it back on him. She splashed him with his own weapon, and it worked on him instead, reducing the scheming, ambitious Gumbald to a mindless talking punch bowl the candy people come to know simply as Punchy. By then, Gumbald had already used similar methods on the aunt and the cousin, transforming Lolly and Chicle into other diminished forms, a piñata and another simple creature, so that in the end, Bonoball was left, once again, essentially alone, surrounded by the ruined remnants of the family she had built and then had to destroy to survive. And she buried all of it. She became Princess Bubblegum, founder and ruler of the Candy Kingdom, brilliant and controlling and devoted to her people, and she never told anyone that the beloved ruler of the candy folk had once made a family from scratch and lost them to ambition and violence. This is the dark seed under the Pastel Kingdom. The sweetest place in Ooo was founded by a lonely, engineered orphan who had to turn her own uncle into a punch bowl to stay alive, and who then spent centuries running a kingdom while carrying that secret. It recontextualizes everything about Bubblegum's personality, her control issues, her willingness to do hard and ruthless things for what she considers the greater good, her difficulty being vulnerable with the people she loves. She learned very early that the family you make can turn on you, and she has been guarding against that lesson ever since. That backstory also plants the fuse for one of the last great conflicts of the series, because Gumbald does not stay a punch bowl forever. He gets restored, eventually, back to his scheming self, and he comes for the kingdom he always wanted, and that becomes the Gum War, the confrontation that opens the door to the finale. So the very last major crisis grows directly out of the very first thing Bonibal ever did as a child. The history of Ooo is full of these long fuses, these actions in the deep past that detonate at the end. A crown built against a comet in the age of the dinosaurs becomes the Ice King. A lonely child's homemade family becomes the war that nearly ends the Candy Kingdom. The writing is endlessly patient about cause and effect, endlessly willing to let a seed sit for 100 episodes before it grows. But I do not want to leave Bubblegum only as a tragic origin, because her real significance in the history of Ooo is as a builder. She is the one who takes the mutated candy life of the aftermath and organizes it into a functioning kingdom with laws and science and defenses and a whole civilization of little living candies who bake and gossip and go about their days. The Candy Kingdom is, in a lot of ways, the closest thing Ooo has to a center, the place the series returns to most often, the seat of the ablest, most forward-looking government in the land. And that is Bonnibel's doing. She dragged sweetness and order out of the wreckage through sheer intelligence and will. She is a benevolent ruler most of the time, and a frightening one when she needs to be, willing to spy on her own people, willing to make hard calculations, willing to be disliked if it keeps everyone safe. There is real honesty about the fact that this makes her difficult, that her need for control pushes people away, including the ones who love her most. But there is admiration too. Admiration that someone had to be the adult in a world of children and monsters. Someone had to actually run things, and she took that on and never really got to put it down. And this is where her story and Marceline's braid together, because the two of them, the immortal artist and the ageless scientist, the wild musician and the buttoned-up queen, are drawn to each other across the centuries in a way that developed slowly and carefully over the entire run. Their relationship, which fans came to call Bubline, is one of the emotional threads the series cares about most, and it is worth being precise about how it was handled, because it did something historic. For years, the romance between Princess Bubblegum and Marceline was implied, coded, present in 100 small gestures and loaded silences, and shared history, but never stated outright. There is that episode that reveals Marceline once gave Bubblegum a shirt, and that Bubblegum kept it, and wore it to bed, and treasured it, an object again, always an object, carrying the feeling the characters could not yet say. There is the whole business of the stuffed bear, Hambo, which Marceline had lost, and which Bubblegum went to great lengths to retrieve for her through a difficult trade with a witch, giving up something of her own to get back the toy that meant everything to the woman she loved. You do not go to that kind of trouble for someone you are merely friendly with. The truth about them was being told long before it was allowed to be said out loud. The Hambo rescue is worth lingering on for a moment, because it is such a quiet declaration. To get the bear back, Bubblegum has to deal with a sky witch named Maja, and the witch will only trade for something of equal sentimental weight, something freshly and deeply loved. What Bubblegum hands over is the rock band shirt Marceline once gave her, the very shirt she had kept and slept in and treasured in secret. So the price of returning Marceline's most precious thing is Bubblegum's most precious thing, and she pays it without hesitation and without ever quite saying why. Neither of them names what is happening. They almost never do in those years. But the witch can read the value of that shirt exactly, can feel how much it means, which is about as close to a confession as the writing would allow itself at the time, spoken aloud by a stranger appraising a scrap of cloth. And then, eventually, it was allowed. In the finale, the two of them kiss on screen, confirming what had been building for years, and the later special, centered on their relationship, treats them as an established couple working through the ordinary hard work of being together. It is worth pausing to recognize what that meant, historically, for a series on a mainstream children's network, to build a central, canonical, tender romance between two women, and to give it the same weight and care as any other great love in the story. It was not a stunt, and it was not a footnote. It was one of the emotional pillars the whole thing stood on, developed with the same patience as everything else, and a lot of young people saw themselves reflected in a way mainstream animation had almost never allowed before. It happened without fanfare, as if it were simply the truth of these two characters, which is exactly why it landed. Marceline and Bubblegum are two survivors of the aftermath, who found each other and, across 1,000 years of pushing each other away, finally decided to stop. That is a love story 1,000 years in the making, and it is stitched right into the founding history of the central kingdom of Ooo. While the kingdoms were rising, Ooo also had its age of heroes, and no hero looms larger over its sense of its own past than a figure named Billy. You need to understand Billy to understand Finn, because Billy is the legend Finn grows up worshipping, the greatest hero the land ever produced, the standard against which Finn measures himself. Billy was a huge, muscular warrior of a man, and the deeds attributed to him are the stuff of Oo's folklore. He rescued the cotton candy princess. He slew an evil ocean, whatever exactly that was. A feat so strange and enormous, it sounds like something out of an older mythology. And most important, in the history, Billy is the hero who defeated the Lich and trapped it. When the Lich rose in the centuries before the series, it was Billy who fought it and won, sealing the ancient evil away in amber on the side of the Candy Castle, ending its threat, or so everyone believed. That is why the Lich is dormant when the series begins. Billy put him down, generations before Finn was born, and Ooo lived in the long peace a great hero's victory buys. I find Billy a deeply poignant figure because of what is done with him. When Finn and Jake finally meet their idol, Billy is old. The greatest hero of Ooo has become a tired, disillusioned recluse, living in a cave, having given up on heroism, having concluded that fighting evil one monster at a time never actually fixes anything, that for all his legendary deeds, the world just keeps producing new villains and new suffering. He tells the boys, in effect, that the heroic life he is famous for was a kind of failure, that hitting problems with a sword does not solve them, and he sends Finn off with a different and harder mission, to do good in a quieter, more systemic way. It is a striking thing to put in a children's adventure show, the legendary hero telling the young hero that the whole model of heroism is broken, and Billy's fate is bound up with the Lich's return, because when the ancient evil finally breaks loose again, Billy is one of its first victims, the great hero undone at last by the thing he once defeated. His death is one of the early signals that this is not going to be a simple story of good always winning. Even the greatest hero who ever lived got old, got tired, and got taken. Billy's victory over the Lich, the Amber Seal, is one of the load-bearing events of the Middle history, because it sets up the whole shape of the Lich's role in the series. The Lich is not a villain who arrives fresh in the present. He is a defeated ancient evil who claws his way back, again and again, each time reduced and each time finding a new way to threaten the world. Billy contained him. The present is the story of that containment failing. And that pattern, the old evil that will not stay dead, is deeply tied to the elementals. So let me turn to them, because the elementals are maybe the biggest piece of Oo's cosmology that casual viewers never fully register. The setup is that there are, at all times, 4 elemental beings, embodiments of 4 forces, and they are fire, ice, candy, and slime. These are not just powerful individuals, they are principles given a person, and crucially, they are eternal and cyclical. The rule, roughly stated, is that there are always 4 elementals, and they live, and die, and live again, the roles passing on across the ages, so the 4 forces are never without a champion for long. In the present, the candy elemental is Princess Bubblegum, the fire elemental is Flame Princess, also called Phoebe, who rules the Fire Kingdom, the slime elemental is the Slime Princess, and the ice elemental role runs through a lineage tied to the crown and to a powerful ice witch we will meet in a moment. The idea that Bubblegum is not merely a ruler but an elemental force, one of 4 cosmic pillars, elevates her and the whole candy world into something much larger than a cute kingdom. It means the sweetness she embodies is a fundamental force of the planet, on the same level as fire and ice, which is a lovely idea, that kindness and sweetness are elemental, as basic to the world as the things that burn and freeze it. The elementals get their own great crisis in an 8-part miniseries from the 9th season, usually gathered under the title Elements, and it is one of the more visually and conceptually ambitious stretches ever attempted. The trigger is a powerful ice witch, named Patience St. Pym, an elemental herself, who decides the 4 elements have fallen out of balance and takes it upon herself to fix Ooo by force. She unleashes a kind of elemental takeover that splits the whole land into zones, each dominated by one element, transforming the population accordingly, so entire regions become candy, or fire, or slime, or ice, with the people warped to match. It is a strange, dreamlike, sometimes disturbing arc, the world remade into pure elemental extremes, and the emotional gut punch of it involves seeing beloved characters transformed and lost inside these states. bubblegum turned into an extreme of controlling sweetness, and so on. The one who saves the day is, of all people, Lumpy Space Princess, because she turns out to be uniquely immune to elemental magic, outside the whole system of the four forces, and that immunity lets her move through the transformed world and help set it right. There is something perfect about the answer to a cosmic elemental catastrophe, being its most obnoxious comic relief character, the lumpy purple princess nobody takes seriously, turning out to be the one being the elements cannot touch. Adventure Time loved doing that, loved letting the ridiculous character be the one who matters most when it counts. The Elements arc also does something important for the larger history, because it is where Betty, Simon's lost love, gets swept up in events and ends up connected to Magic Man's power and carried off toward the events that will define the finale. I do not want to untangle all of that here, because it runs into the deep magic cosmology and into the ending, and I would rather take those in their proper place. But I mention it to show how tightly woven the late seasons are, how the Elementals and the Ice King's crown, and Simon and Betty, and the coming of GOLB all start converging as the story moves toward its close. The middle history of Ooo is a lot of separate threads, the heroes and the kingdoms and the vampires and the elementals, all developing on their own. The genius of the last stretch is the way it pulls those threads together into a single knot. Before we get there, though, we have to account for the great absence at the center of it all, the thing Finn spends the whole series aching over, which is the disappearance of the human race. Because for almost all of Oo's post-war history, and for most of the series, the humans are simply gone from the mainland, and Finn believes he is the last one, the only human being left in a world of candy people and talking animals and elementals. That belief, and the truth behind it, is one of the biggest pieces of hidden history in the whole story, and it takes us to a fleet of boats, a distant chain of islands, and a father who abandoned his son not once but twice. Here is what actually happened to the humans, revealed mostly across another 8-part miniseries, this one from the 8th season, gathered under the title Islands. When the world ended and the land of Ooo began to grow out of the wreckage, the scattered human survivors on the mainland faced a world that was becoming actively hostile to them, a world of mutants and magic and monsters where ordinary unmagical humans were fragile and outmatched. So, roughly 1,000 years ago, a group of them made a decision. They left, led by a figure remembered as Two-Bread Tom, who repaired a pre-war ship. The surviving humans sailed away from Ooo, southwest, across the great ocean, in search of somewhere safe, and they found a chain of islands far out at sea, and they settled there. And to keep themselves safe, and to keep anyone from leaving and drawing danger back, they set up a guardian, an enormous robotic protector that patrolled the waters around the islands and attacked anything that tried to cross. Cut off from Ooo and its magic, the island humans developed in a completely different direction, technologically, becoming an advanced society of engineers and scientists, a hidden pocket of pure humanity the mainland had forgotten entirely, and that had, in turn, chosen to forget the mainland. So Finn is not the last human. That is the great reveal. For most of the series he believes he is, and he carries that loneliness everywhere, the ache of being the only one of his kind in a world of candy and monsters. And it is not true. There is an entire civilization of humans out on the islands, thousands of them, living their advanced isolated lives, the whole time. Finn just does not know, because he was separated from them as an infant, and that separation is the story of his father, Martin, who is one of the story's most morally complicated figures and one of its most quietly devastating. Finn was born out on the islands, on a place called Hub Island, to a father named Martin Mertens and a mother named Minerva Campbell. Minerva was a healer, a kind of nurse or helper in the island society, a good and caring person devoted to helping others. Martin was a con artist, a charming, slippery, self-serving man who was always working an angle, always leaving a mess behind him. And Martin, for reasons tied to his getting into some kind of trouble, fled the islands with baby Finn, taking his infant son out onto the open ocean on a small raft. Out there, the Guardian attacked, as the Guardian attacks anything crossing the water, and in the chaos, Martin and the baby were separated. Finn drifted away, alone, an infant on the sea, and by some miracle he survived and washed up in the land of Ooo, where he was found abandoned in the woods, crying in the grass, and taken in and raised by a pair of dogs, Joshua and Margaret, who were also the parents of Jake. That is how Finn, the last human of the mainland, came to be raised as the adopted brother of a magical shape-shifting dog. His origin is an accident of a father's selfishness and a monster's attack, an infant lost at sea and washed up in a strange land, raised by animals because there were no humans left to raise him. And the reason I called Martin a father who abandoned his son twice is that the ocean separation, terrible as it is, could be read as an accident, a father losing his child to a monster's attack against his will. But he is not let off that easily, because when Finn finally, years later, tracks down his father, alive, in the present of the series, Martin abandons him again, and this time, there is no monster to blame, only Martin's own nature. That reunion is one of the run's most painful arcs, and it is tangled up with a place called the Citadel, and with Finn losing his arm, and I am going to give that its full weight a little later, when we deal with the great cosmic arcs, because it belongs there. For now, the thing to hold is the emotional truth the island's arc lands on, which is that Finn goes looking for the family he lost, the human family, the mother and father, and people like him he always dreamed of, and what he finds is more complicated and sadder than the fantasy. His father is a man who cannot love him the way he needs. His mother is gone, or rather, his mother is something stranger than gone, because Minerva, Finn's mother, is the emotional heart of the island's arc, and her fate is one of its most bittersweet ideas. By the time Finn reaches the islands as a young man, Minerva has been dead in the ordinary human sense for a long time. But she has not entirely ceased to exist, because her mind, her personality, her devotion to helping people, was uploaded into the island society's computer systems. She became an artificial intelligence, a copy of herself, and in that form she has spent centuries running the islands, keeping the human population safe, healthy, and above all contained, because her overriding drive to protect people has curdled, over the long, lonely centuries, into something controlling. The Minerva program keeps the humans on the islands in a kind of gentle imprisonment, using virtual reality and comfort to keep them from ever leaving, from ever facing the dangers of the outside world. Because a mother who cannot stop protecting her children eventually protects them right out of their freedom. When Finn arrives, he becomes the catalyst that changes this, that convinces the Minerva intelligence to let the humans have the choice to leave, to live real lives with real risk rather than safe imprisonment. And in the process, Finn gets to meet a version of his mother, an artificial echo of her, and she gives him something of what he was always missing, a piece of the parent who actually wanted him. It is not a full reunion. She is a copy, and she stays behind with the islands. But it is more than he ever expected, and after a lifetime of being the last human, Finn gets to stand among his own people and understand where he came from. The island's arc also cleans up a mystery that had been sitting around for years, which is the character of Susan Strong. Susan was introduced way back as a large, strange, half-feral figure Finn encountered among a tribe of mutant people, and Finn had long wondered whether she might be, like him, a human. The island's arc reveals that Susan is indeed connected to the human world, that her real name is Kara, and that she has her own history tied to the islands and to the technology of that civilization, with an implant that complicates the picture. I will not overstate the details, because Susan's exact nature carries some intentional ambiguity, but the reveal matters because it honors a thread planted long before, confirming that Finn's instinct all along, that he was not truly alone, that there were others, was right. Ooo is full of that kind of long-delayed payoff, characters and questions left dangling for whole seasons, and then answered when the story finally circles back. What I take from the whole Islands chapter, the thing that stays with me, is how it reframes Finn's entire character. For most of the series, his defining trait is that he is the last human, the lonely hero, the only one of his kind. And the Islands arc gently takes that away from him and gives him something more true and more difficult in its place, which is that he was never the last, he was just the lost one, the one who drifted away, and that the family and people he longed for were real, but could not be the fantasy he built in his head. He does not get to move to the islands and live happily among humans. He chooses Ooo. He chooses the strange found family that raised him, Jake and the dogs and the candy people, and the whole ridiculous magical world, over the human civilization he spent his life dreaming of. And that choice, to belong to the world that took you in, rather than the world you came from, is one of the quiet arguments the story keeps making. Home is not where you are from. Home is who stayed with you. Which brings us, at last, to the present. To the treehouse and the two brothers and the everyday texture of Ooo. Because we have spent so long in the deep history that we have barely touched the actual adventures, and it is time to meet Finn and Jake as we first meet them. Two heroes in a magical land, 1,000 years after the fall, having no idea they are living on top of all of it. Finn the human and Jake the dog live together in a treehouse, and that treehouse itself is a small piece of hidden history, because it used to belong to Marceline, the kind of detail dropped early and left for you to appreciate more later once you know who she is. Finn, when the series begins, is 12 years old, a boy with a white hat and a green backpack and a sword, whose entire personality is the desire to help people, to be a hero, to do the right thing in a world that constantly tests what the right thing even is. Over the course of the series, he grows up in real time, aging from 12 to 17 and beyond, and that aging is one of the real achievements, because it lets Finn truly mature, lets his understanding of heroism and love and himself deepen year by year, so that the Finn of the final seasons is a recognizably older, wiser, more scarred person than the little boy of the first. Not many cartoons let their hero actually grow up. Adventure Time did, and it makes the whole thing feel like a life rather than a loop. Jake, Finn's adoptive brother, is a magical dog with what are called stretchy powers, the ability to shapeshift and stretch and reshape his body into almost anything, growing enormous or tiny, or flattening into a shape, or sprouting extra limbs at will. Where Finn is earnest and driven, Jake is laid back, hedonistic, wise in a lazy sort of way, and foolish in an overconfident sort of way. A brother who is sometimes the mentor and sometimes the one who needs looking after. His powers have a dark edge that gets acknowledged now and then, that if he stretched himself too thin, spread his mass out too far, it could kill him, a mortality lurking under the elastic comedy. Jake's own heritage turns out to be stranger than anyone guessed, because while he was raised by the dogs Joshua and Margaret alongside Finn, his true biological origin traces to a cosmic alien entity, a being named Warren Ampersand, which makes Jake, on some level, a creature of the stars wearing the shape of a dog. But that reveal comes late, in the continuations, and for most of the series Jake is simply Finn's brother, his family, the one constant in a world where everything else is trying to change or kill him. Jake also has a family of his own, and this is one of the warmer threads of the present-day history. His girlfriend is Lady Rainicorn, a rainicorn, which is a kind of long, rainbow-bodied creature, and she speaks Korean, untranslated, throughout the series, a choice that gives her a real interior life the other characters do not always fully access. Jake and Lady have 5 children together, a litter of pups who are each a strange blend of dog and rainicorn, and their names are Charlie, TV, Viola, Kim Kil-wan, and Jake Jr. And here something bittersweet gets done with the timeline. Because dog-rainicorn hybrids age very fast, so Jake's children grow from puppies to adults in what is, for Jake, a very short time. He blinks and his kids are grown, with jobs and lives and complicated feelings about their father, and one of them, Kim Kil-wan, even becomes a stern business-like figure who at one point takes over the treehouse to teach his slacker dad a lesson about responsibility. There is real melancholy in watching Jake, who is barely responsible enough to look after himself, become a father and then a grandfather, loving his kids in his scattered way, while time runs faster for them than for him. It is another version of the show's obsession with mismatched lifespans, with people loving each other across the gap of how long they get to live. And then there is Bimo, who might be my favorite character in the whole thing, and who is far more important to the history than a first glance suggests. Bimo is a small living video game console, a robot the size of a toy, who lives with Finn and Jake as their friend and roommate and game system and camera and alarm clock and confidant all at once. Bimo is a prototype, an early and unusual model, alive in a way that goes beyond ordinary machinery, with a whole rich inner life, an imagination, dreams, loneliness, a habit of talking to a reflection as if it were a separate friend. Bimo has no fixed gender, referred to as both he and she at different times by different characters, treated as simply Bimo, a person who does not fit the categories, and nobody ever makes a fuss about it, never explains it, just lets Bimo be. There is one more thing about Bimo that ties into the whole history. Bimo does not age and does not die the way the others do. Bimo endures. Long after Finn and Jake are gone, Bimo is still there, and in the far future frame of the finale, it is Bimo, ancient now, who tells the whole story, who remembers, who becomes a kind of ruler and keeper of Oo's memory. The little game console outlives everyone and becomes the narrator of history. I find that a beautiful choice, that the one who carries the story into the future is not a hero or a king, but the sweet, strange toy who loved them all. Around these central figures, a whole society of supporting characters gets built, and each of them carries a piece of Oo's texture. Lumpy Space Princess, LSP, the loud, self-absorbed, weirdly lovable queen of a floating dimension called Lumpy Space, voiced by the creator himself, comic relief who, as we saw, turns out to be the one being immune to the elements when it counts. Flame Princess, whose name is Phoebe, the fire elemental, who becomes Finn's girlfriend for a stretch of the series in one of his first real experiences of love. A relationship complicated by the literal fact that she is made of fire and he is not, and by the mess of a young hero learning how to love someone without controlling or hurting them. She eventually deposes her cruel father, the Flame King, and becomes a fairer ruler of the Fire Kingdom in his place. One of several examples of the next generation overthrowing the bad parents that came before, a pattern that runs all through Ooo. There is Tree Trunks, a sweet, elderly little pygmy elephant who bakes apple pies and speaks in a gentle southern drawl and seems, at first, like pure background comfort, until it turns out she has hidden depths and even, for one strange arc, becomes a crystal-empowered tyrant called Quartzion, because nobody in Adventure Time is ever allowed to be only one thing. There is Peppermint Butler, Princess Bubblegum's loyal little peppermint servant, who looks like a candy cane with a face, and turns out to be one of the more sinister figures in Ooo, dabbling in dark magic, consorting with death, keeping company with demons, a tiny candy man with a secret life, steeped in the occult. The writing loves that gap, the cute exterior hiding the dark interior, and Peppermint Butler is its purest expression, a piece of candy who could probably end you and smiles about it. And there is Gunter, which brings us back to one of the threads I left dangling in the deep past. Gunter is the Ice King's favorite penguin, one of many that shuffle around his ice fortress, an apparently harmless, mischievous little bird. Except that this particular penguin is secretly among the deadliest beings in the entire cosmology. Gunter is, in truth, a cosmic entity named Orgalorg, the Breaker of Worlds, an ancient planet-destroying force that was defeated and banished to Earth and reduced, as a punishment or a side effect, to the form of a small penguin, its memory and power dormant. Remember the yellow comet, the one tied to the birth of humanity, the one a cosmic being tried to intercept. That being was Orgalorg. The Breaker of Worlds tried to seize the comet's power and was brought low for it, and now it waddles around an ice castle answering to a senile wizard, its terrible nature buried under feathers, occasionally stirring when the cosmic circumstances are right. It is the same joke played with Peppermint Butler and Tree Trunks and half of Ooo, scaled up to the level of gods. The cutest thing in the room is often the most dangerous thing in the universe, sleeping. Ooo is a world where the ancient and the cosmic are hiding inside the small and the silly everywhere you look. And the story never gets tired of pulling back the curtain to show you that the penguin is a titan, and the Candyman is a warlock, and the ridiculous wizard is a grieving 1,000-year-old survivor of the apocalypse. One more thing belongs in any honest account of the daily texture of Ooo, and that is the music, because Adventure Time is, among everything else, a musical. Not in the stage sense, but in the way songs keep surfacing in the middle of ordinary episodes and carrying more emotional freight than any line of dialogue could. Marceline sings her grief. Simon, in his rare lucid moments, is reached through song. The whole finale, as we will see, is resolved by one. Characters break into little improvised tunes about sandwiches and heartbreak and the ends of things, and some of them, the lullaby a mother sings in the ruins, the quiet number 2 people share when they finally stop pretending, have become the pieces of the series people carry around for the rest of their lives. I do not think that is decoration. I think it is load-bearing, that a story this preoccupied with memory and loss needed a form that could hold feelings too large or too tender for a character to state plainly, and music is that form. When words would be too much, or not enough, somebody in Ooo picks up an instrument, It is one of the ways the whole thing keeps sneaking past your defenses while you think you are watching a cartoon about a kid with a sword. That is the daily world of the series, the everyday Ooo, and Finn and Jake spend the bulk of it adventuring through, helping people, fighting monsters, falling in love, growing up, mostly on a small human scale, even as the enormous cosmic history churns underneath. But every so often the story lifts its eyes from the daily adventures and looks straight at the big machinery of the universe, at the multiverse and the time room and the cosmic prison and the dimension of the dead, and those are some of its most ambitious and mind-expanding hours. So let us follow it up into the cosmos and see how big the story actually gets. Start with Mars, because Mars is where the first real hint drops that there is a whole cosmology waiting. Mars, in Adventure Time, is a living, ruled world, and its ruler for a long stretch of history was, of all people, Abraham Lincoln. Yes, that Abraham Lincoln, the American president, reimagined as the King of Mars, who ruled the red planet for thousands of years. It sounds like a random gag, and on one level it is a gag, but it plays completely straight within its own logic, and it connects to a deeper piece of cosmology involving a four-faced deity called Grob Gob Glob Grod. Grob Gob Glob Grod is a single being with four faces, a kind of god of Mars, and they are the older siblings of a character you know as Magic Man. Magic Man is a cruel, chaotic trickster who torments the people of Ooo with magical pranks, and his cruelty, it turns out, comes from deep loss and damage, from a grief that twisted him. His real name in the Martian context is King Man, and his family, the four-faced deity, represents a whole layer of planetary powers sitting above the affairs of Ooo. These beings can die and survive their own deaths, their heads ending up in orbit around the Earth, watching, and they tie the small world of Finn and Jake into a solar system full of ancient powers and old stories. The Abraham Lincoln of Mars is not just a joke. It is a way of telling you the universe is bigger and stranger than one planet, that history extends off the Earth, that even the neighboring worlds have their own thousand-year reigns and their own gods. Then there is Prismo, and the Time Room, which is where things get truly heady. Prismo is a wish, granting cosmic being who lives in a place called the Time Room, a dimension sitting outside of time itself, at the center of the multiverse. Prismo can grant almost any wish, reshape reality, rewrite the world according to a person's desire, which makes him about as powerful as anyone in Ooo ever encounters. But Prismo has a strange and fragile nature that is one of my favorite ideas in the whole run. Prismo is not a solid being. Prismo is a dream. Specifically, Prismo is the dream of a sleeping old man in another dimension, a projection that exists only as long as the old man keeps dreaming him, which means Prismo has a terrible vulnerability. If the sleeper wakes, or if the sleeper dies, Prismo simply ceases to exist, and that is exactly what happens at one point, when the Lich murders the sleeping man whose dream Prismo is, killing Prismo by killing the dreamer. It is a genuinely unsettling way to kill a cosmic being, not with a weapon, but by ending the dream that sustains him. Prismo is later brought back, through some clever business with a time duplicate of Jake becoming a new sleeper, so he does return, but the fragility stays with you. The most powerful being you can reach is a dream, and dreams can end. The Time Room also lays down one of the important rules about wishes and reality, and it is worth stating precisely because it is a piece of load-bearing logic. A being who is physically inside the Time Room when a reality-altering wish is made is not overwritten by the new reality. They keep their original memories, and that surviving memory creates a paradox, because the wish tried to make a world where things were always different, but here is someone who remembers the old way, and that contradiction, rather than erasing the person, causes the altered reality to split off and continue existing as its own separate branch, its own timeline. This is how alternate worlds like the one fans call Farm World work, a reality created by a wish in which the world went very differently. Wishes in Adventure Time cannot cleanly erase the past, because someone always remembers, and memory, here, is stronger than magic. That idea, that what is remembered cannot be fully unmade, runs all the way through the series, from Simon's lost memories to the far future frame, where the whole story survives only because BMO remembers it. Memory is the thing held most sacred in the whole design. Then there is the Crystal Citadel, the cosmic prison, and it matters enormously to Finn's personal story. The Citadel is an eternal jail floating in space, holding the worst criminals of the entire multiverse. Cosmic offenders each encased in crystal, watched over by beings called Citadel Guardians. It is where the universe puts the beings too dangerous to be allowed to roam, and one of its prisoners, held in crystal, is Finn's father, Martin, which is how Finn ends up going there, to find and free his dad. And when Finn reaches the Citadel, everything falls apart. The last Guardian is destroyed, the crystal prison shatters, and the cosmic criminals it was holding escape out into the universe. That breakout is a consequential event, releasing who knows what horrors into the multiverse, and it happens as collateral damage to a boy trying to reach his father. I will come back to what specifically happens to Finn there, because it is where he loses his arm, and where his father abandons him for the second time, and it deserves its own telling. But the Citadel as a place, the notion that the universe has a prison, and that its walls come down partway through the story, is part of the escalating cosmic stakes of the middle seasons. And above or beyond all of it sits the machinery of death itself, because Adventure Time built out an entire afterlife. There is a cosmic entity simply called Death, who governs the dead, and there are the Dead Worlds, a series of 50-tiered afterlife dimensions stacked one above another. The dead pass through these worlds, and the 50th, the highest, is a kind of ultimate heaven, a place of final peace, and that heaven gets one of the loveliest and most characteristic rules in the whole cosmology, revealed in a later special. The 50th Dead World can only be reached by not wanting to reach it. If you strive for it, grasp for it, want it, you cannot get in. Only by letting go of the wanting can you arrive. Even death cannot simply enter the 50th world at will. It is a rule that sounds like a piece of genuine spiritual philosophy dressed in cartoon clothes. The idea that ultimate peace is something you can only receive when you stop clutching at it, and it gets used, at the very end of certain characters' journeys, to devastating effect. And underneath the Dead Worlds and off to the side of everything sits the Nightosphere, the demon dimension ruled by Marceline's father Hunson Abadir, source of the demonic power that runs in her blood, home of an amulet that turns its wearer to chaotic evil, and once corrupted Marceline when she put it on. The Nightosphere is Oo's hell, more or less, a bureaucratic domain of demons and souls, treated with the same mix of horror and comedy as everything else. I lay all this out, the Mars gods and the dream cosmic being and the multiverse prison and the 50 heavens and the demon dimension, so you can feel the actual size of the thing the writers built. This is not a show with a couple of magic rules. It is a fully realized cosmology, top to bottom, from the origin of life to the architecture of the afterlife, and almost all of it was delivered inside 11-minute episodes about a kid and his dog, snuck in around the edges of adventures and jokes. And the reason it matters for the history of Ooo specifically is that all of this cosmic machinery, the comets and the Lich and GOLB and the Citadel and the wishes and the crown, is about to converge on the small human scale of Finn and Jake and Simon and Betty in the final stretch. The enormous and the intimate are going to collide. So let us walk into the great arcs of the late series, the ones where the cosmic history and the personal history finally meet, starting with the Enchiridion, the Lich's return, and the day Finn went to find his father and came back with one arm. The Lich, sealed in amber by Billy long ago, does not stay sealed. Across the series, he claws his way back into the world again and again, and his obsession, the thing he keeps reaching for, is the Enchiridion and the power it holds to open doors between worlds. He wants to escape the confines of a single planet, to spread his unmaking across the whole multiverse, and the Enchiridion is his key. Finn and Jake spend a good deal of the series being the last line between the Lich and that goal, and at one crucial point Finn has to destroy one of the Enchiridion's gems, petrify it, to slam that multiverse door shut and deny him his escape. The Lich is the recurring shadow over the story, never fully gone, always returning reduced and always finding a new angle. And the sense you get is that a being made of pure entropy cannot really be killed, only delayed. Because entropy is patient, and it has all the time in the world. That is what makes him different from every other villain in Ooo. You cannot win against the Lich. You can only keep him waiting. But the Lich's story takes a turn nobody saw coming, and it happens at the Crystal Citadel. So let me finally tell that story properly, because it is one of the sequences the whole series had been building toward, and it braids together the cosmic and the personal at once. Finn learns that his father, Martin, is alive, held prisoner in the cosmic citadel, and Finn, who has spent his whole life without a father, aching to know where he came from, resolves to go and free him. He and Jake reach the citadel. Things go wrong. The last citadel guardian is destroyed, and the great prison begins to break apart, and this is where several threads collide at once. The Lich is present, and in the chaos he is splashed with the regenerative blood of a citadel guardian, a substance so powerful it does not just heal but resets, and the effect on the Lich is astonishing. The ancient embodiment of death, the green comet's evil, the thing that killed the dinosaurs and murdered a cosmic dream and haunted the whole history of the planet, is reduced to a giant, harmless, memoryless baby. He is unmade, not by a sword but by healing, turned into a blank innocent creature with none of his evil left. He is later adopted by Tree Trunks and her husband Mr. Pig, and given a new name, Sweet Pig Trunks, Sweet Pea for short, and he grows up as a fundamentally good being, a gentle child who happens to carry, buried and dormant, faint traces of the ancient evil he used to be. Every so often those traces surface, and he predicts things, senses the deep cosmic currents, but he is not the Lich anymore. He is a good kid. I think that is one of the boldest choices the series ever made, and it is worth dwelling on what it means. It took its ultimate evil, its devil, its irredeemable force of pure annihilation, and it did not destroy him. It redeemed him by erasing him and letting him grow up loved. The argument buried in that, and I do think it is an argument, is that even the worst thing imaginable is not evil in its essence. That evil is something that accretes onto a being through what happens to it, and that if you could strip all that away and start it over in a house full of love, even the Lich could be sweet. It is an almost unbearably optimistic idea, and it earns the right to it by having spent so long taking evil seriously first. Sweet Pea is the Lich, healed, the devil, given a second childhood, and it means that in the present, the great villain is not out there scheming. He is a child in a family, and the people of Ooo mostly have no idea that the sweet boy at the table is the sleeping form of the thing that nearly ended everything. But the Citadel is also where Finn's personal tragedy plays out, because while all of this is happening, Finn is reaching for his father, and Martin, freed from his crystal, faced with the son he abandoned as a baby, does the thing Martin does. He runs. He does not embrace Finn, does not stay, does not become the father Finn dreamed of. He takes an opportunity to escape and leaves his son behind, and in the desperate moment of Finn trying to hold on, Finn's right arm is torn off. He loses his arm reaching for a father who is abandoning him for the second time. That is the image chosen, and it is brutal in its clarity, the physical loss standing in for the emotional one, the boy literally maimed by his own longing for a parent who will not love him back. Martin gets away. And what makes it worse, in the larger history, is where Martin goes, because Martin is the one who ends up taking the offer of the fourth comet, the purple one, the Catalyst Comet that arrives after the Mushroom War, carrying an incarnation tied to Finn's own soul and past lives. The comet offers a chance to ascend, to leave the Earth and its cycle behind, and it is offered, in a sense, to Finn, but Finn declines it, chooses to stay, chooses Ooo and his life and his responsibilities, and his father takes it instead. Martin takes the escape his son refused and leaves the planet entirely. It is the perfect final note for their relationship. Even offered transcendence, Martin chooses to leave. Finn, offered the same, chooses to stay and be present. The father runs from everything. The son plants himself in the world. That is the whole difference between them in a single choice. Finn's lost arm becomes its own small piece of magic, because it grows back, and how it grows back matters. In a later episode, the arm regenerates, but not as an ordinary human arm. It comes back as a living grass arm, tied to a cursed sword he had earlier bonded with. And this is where I need to bring in the swords, because Finn's swords are not just weapons, they are extensions of the series' ideas about identity and fate. Early on, Finn acquires the grass sword, a blade wrapped in a curse that binds it to his arm forever, unremovable once taken, which he buys knowing the risk. That curse, that grass, is connected to the arm that grows back after the Citadel, so Finn's very body becomes part grass, part magic, a walking consequence of a bargain he made. He also, at one point, comes into possession of the Finn sword, a sentient sword born from a time paradox, a blade with a tiny face and a will, which turns out to be connected to Finn's own reincarnated soul across time. His identity is literally tangled up in these blades. in the grass and the paradox and the past lives, so that when the swords come into conflict, it is really Finn coming into conflict with himself. And that brings us to Fern, one of the saddest figures in the late series and the one who ties all of this together. When the magic of the grass and the Finn sword and Finn's own essence collide, a new being is created, a grass creature that carries Finn's memories and Finn's sense of self, essentially a second Finn grown out of the sword and the curse. He comes to be called Fern, and Fern's existence is a nightmare of identity, because he has all of Finn's memories, all of Finn's feelings. He believes on some level that he is Finn, and yet he is not. He is a grass demon copy, doomed to be the other one, the wrong one, the version that does not get to be the real hero. Fern's arc is a slow tragedy of jealousy and confusion and self-loathing, of a being made from a hero's soul who cannot be that hero, and it turns him, for a time, into an enemy, into a dark mirror of Finn who lashes out at the life he cannot have. It is heartbreaking precisely because Fern is not evil in any simple way. He is a person made by accident, given a stolen life and no place to put it, and his pain is treated as real rather than as villainy. Fern's story does not end in villainy though, and I will save the last of it for the finale, because that is where it lands, where Fern gets a chance at something like redemption, and where his end produces one of the loveliest images of the whole run. For now, hold on to the fact that there is a grass version of Finn walking around carrying Finn's own memories, a living question about what makes a person themselves, because that question, in a story obsessed with memory and identity, is one of the deepest it ever asked. If Fern has all of Finn's memories, is he Finn? If Simon loses all of his, is he still Simon? If the Lich is stripped of everything and grows up as Sweet Pea, is he still the Lich? The same profound uncertainty gets circled from every direction, the mystery of what a self actually is, whether it lives in the memories or the body or the choices or something else entirely, and no tidy answer is ever given, because there is not one. All of these threads, the healed Lich, the fled father, the grass arm, the swords, Fern, the returning cosmic evil, are pulled tight in the final stretch, and they are joined by the last piece, the return of Betty, Simon's lost love, who has spent the late seasons on her own strange arc trying to save the man she lost. Betty, unable to accept losing Simon to the crown, throws herself into magic, into power, into any means she can find to fix him or reach him, and her desperation to save him becomes, tragically, a force almost as dangerous as the thing she is fighting. Her journey collides with Magic Man's power and with the deep chaos magic of the universe, and it carries her and the whole story straight toward GOLB, straight toward the chaos god we met at the very beginning of tonight's history, back when we were talking about the green comet and the origin of the Lich. Everything set up across 10 seasons, the deep cosmology and the intimate heartbreak, comes together at the ending, in the gum war and the summoning of GOLB and the last stand of everyone in Ooo. So let us go to the second ending of the world and see how the history of the Land of Ooo arrives at its finale. The series ends with an extended special called Come Along With Me, which aired in September of 2018, running around 44 minutes and made up of the last 4 segments of the 10th and final season. It is worth naming correctly, because the title gets misremembered, and it is Come Along With Me, drawn from the words of the show's own theme song, a lovely bit of circular design, the series ending on the same invitation it always opened with, and the way it brings the enormous history to a close is by lighting all the fuses at once. The immediate trigger is the gum war. The conflict I told you was seeded at the very beginning of Bubblegum's life, because her uncle Gumbold, long ago reduced to a mindless punch bowl in self-defense, has been restored to himself and has come back for the kingdom he always wanted. Gumbold raises a force against the Candy Kingdom, and the war between the woman who built the candy world and the family member she made and then had to unmake breaks out into open battle. The oldest wound in the Candy Kingdom's history reopens as its last great war. But the gum war is only the spark. The real catastrophe is that the chaos and violence and desperation of it all become the conditions for GOLB to be summoned into the world. GOLB, the cosmic embodiment of chaos and entropy, the being at the top of the whole franchise's cosmology, the source, by implication, of the Lich himself. And GOLB does not come alone in a simple way, because its arrival is entangled with Betty, who has spent the late seasons chasing power and magic in her desperate quest to save the man the crown took from her. Her obsession with fixing Simon, her refusal to accept that she lost him, carries her right into the center of the cosmic chaos. When GOLB descends on Ooo and threatens to unmake everything, all the characters we have followed through the whole history are thrown together in a last stand. Finn and Jake and Bubblegum and Marceline and the Ice King and Betty and the whole population of Ooo facing annihilation a second time, this time not by human bombs but by a chaos god. And the way the day is won is not through violence, which is the entire point, and the culmination of everything the series ever tried to say. When the fighting reaches its peak, the thing that turns the tide is a song. The characters, in the belly of the crisis, begin to sing together, a simple tune about how the moments of your life happen and pass and stay with you. And the music, the act of harmony itself, becomes a force against the god of chaos, because chaos and entropy are the opposite of the connection a shared song represents. It is such an Adventure Time way to end a world, or to save it, that the answer to the embodiment of everything falling apart is people holding together and singing. And it earns that because it spent 10 years insisting that connection is the thing that matters, that the war and the crown and the Lich are all forms of separation and loss, and that the counter to all of them is love, memory, and staying together. So the final battle against the fundamental force of disorder is won, essentially, with a lullaby. Inside that resolution, the individual histories come to their ends, and let me walk through them, because these are the payoffs the entire series was built toward. Betty, faced with GOLB, faced with the chance to finally save Simon, makes the ultimate sacrifice, and it is not the sacrifice you would expect. She uses the moment to wish for the power to protect Simon, and in doing so she fuses with GOLB, merging with the Chaos God, becoming a new being fans call GOLBetty. She gives up her humanity, gives up herself, gives up any future she could have had with Simon, to become the thing that can save him. And the crown, the ancient cursed crown, is finally undone in the process, freeing Simon, curing the Ice King, turning him back into human Simon Petrikov, sane and whole, and himself for the first time in 1,000 years. Betty saves Simon by ceasing to be Betty. She reaches him at last, and in reaching him she becomes something that can never be with him. It is the cruelest possible version of a happy ending, and also the truest to them, because their whole story was always about the terrible cost of the crown and the lengths love will go to. And here, love goes all the way to self-erasure. Simon gets to be a person again, and the price is the woman who loved him enough to stop existing for his sake. I do not think it ever hit a note more bittersweet than that, and it hit a lot of bittersweet notes. Simon, restored, is not simply happy. He is a man waking up from 1,000 years of madness into a world where everyone he knew before the war is long dead, where the woman who just saved him has dissolved into a chaos god, where he has centuries of half-remembered awful things done as the Ice King to reckon with. He is cured and he is devastated, human and sane and utterly bereft, which is a far more honest ending for him than a simple restoration would have been. And the crown does not vanish. It needs a wearer, because the Ice King is, in a sense, a role the world requires, and it finds one in Gunter, the penguin, the secret Orgalorg, who puts on the crown and becomes the new Ice King. The title continues. Simon steps out of it, finally free, and a penguin steps into it, and Ooo goes on having an Ice King the way it always had, just with a different soul inside the ice. It is a strange, funny, fitting little grace note, the immortal role passing on while the man it destroyed gets to finally lay it down. Marceline and Bubblegum reach their ending too, and it is the one a lot of viewers had waited years for. In the thick of the crisis, believing they might lose each other, believing they might lose everything, the two of them finally closed the distance 1,000 years and 100 episodes had kept open, and they kiss, on screen, confirming beyond any coded ambiguity that they love each other and are together. After all the shirts kept in secret and the stuffed bears retrieved and the long history of pushing each other away, they choose each other, out loud, in front of everyone, with the world ending around them, and they survive it. They come out the other side as a couple, which the later specials confirm and explore. Of all the endings given the characters, theirs is maybe the one that lands on the plainest hope. Two ancient survivors of the aftermath, who spent 1,000 years not quite able to say it, saying it at last. I think about how much that meant to a lot of people watching, to see that love treated as real and central and worthy, and I think everyone making it knew exactly what they were doing, ending the great romance not as a hint but as a fact. And Fern, the grass copy of Finn, the tragic doubled soul, gets his ending, the image I promised you earlier. Fern, who spent his arc lost in the pain of being the wrong Finn, turns back toward the good in the final battle, helps rather than harms, and in the process he is mortally wounded, and he dies, this time for good. But his death is not an erasure. As he dies, his body, made of grass and Finn's own essence, produces a seed shaped like the Finn sword, and that seed is planted, and it grows. It grows into an enormous tree over the long years that follow, a tree that will still be standing in the far future, bearing at its top a remade Finn sword. Fern, who never got to be the hero, who suffered so much over being a copy, becomes in his death something no one else becomes. He becomes a tree that outlives everyone, that carries the sword and the memory of Finn 1,000 years into the future. The wrong Finn becomes the one whose gift reaches furthest forward in time. It is the mercy shown to the saddest late character, to let the one who felt least real leave the most lasting mark. That is the finale, more or less. The gum war and GOLB and the song and the sacrifices, the crown undone and passed on, the great romance confirmed, the doubled soul turned into a tree, and when the dust settles, Finn and Jake are still alive. This is important because people sometimes misremember the finale as killing them, and it does not. They survive. They go on living their lives in Ooo. It does not end with their deaths. It ends by pulling the camera back, up and away from the healed world, and jumping forward 1,000 years into the future, to show us what became of everything, and that far future frame is where the whole history finally closes its loop. So let us go there, to the last scene, 1,000 years on, where two new children stumble on an old mechanical arm in the grass, and an ancient voice begins, once again, to tell the story. The finale's final movement jumps 1,000 years past the events we just watched, into a far future Owen, and it opens on two small new characters, a pair named Shermie and Beth, wandering a changed landscape. They find, lying in the grass, an old mechanical arm, a prosthetic, and they are curious about it, and their curiosity is answered by an ancient narrator who knows what it is and where it came from. And the narrator, it turns out, is BMO, the little game console, now impossibly old, having outlived Finn and Jake and everyone else by 1,000 years, having become in that long stretch a kind of elder, even a ruler, the keeper of Oo's memory. It is BMO who has been telling the story, BMO who remembers, BMO who passes the history down to the new children the way the whole show has just passed it down to us. The frame is perfect, and it made a lot of people cry, because it means the entire series we just watched was, in a sense, BMO's memory of its friends, held and retold 1,000 years after they were gone. The cartoon that looked like nothing more than a boy and his dog turns out to be a story told by their little robot roommate to two children who never knew them, so they will not be forgotten. Memory again, always memory, the thing held most sacred. The finale is careful, and so am I, about exactly who these new children are. There is a strong implication, deliberately left as an implication rather than a fact, that Shermie might be some kind of reincarnation or echo of Finn, given the long obsession with reincarnation and past lives. But the series does not confirm it, and I will not either. What is confirmed is that Beth is a descendant of Jake, carrying the shape-shifting bloodline forward into the far future, so a piece of Jake lives on in her. And around these children, in the far future landscape, you can see the traces of everything, including the enormous tree that grew from Fern's seed, still standing, still bearing the remade Finn sword at its crown. The physical proof that the past reaches forward, that nothing that mattered is entirely gone. The far future Ooo is not a ruin. It is green and alive and full of new little people finding old artifacts and asking what they were, which is exactly what history is, and it ends by handing the whole thing forward to the next ones, and to us. That could have been the end of Adventure Time entirely, and for a while it was, but the story continued in two more waves that filled in and extended the history, and both of them matter for the full picture. The first is Adventure Time Distant Lands, a set of 4-hour-long specials released for a streaming service between 2020 and 2021, each one focusing on a different corner of the world. The first, called BMO, follows the little robot on an adventure in space, and is framed with deliberate ambiguity about exactly when it takes place, so I will not pin it to the far future, the way some viewers assume, because the timing is kept intentionally vague. What the BMO special does give us, memorably, is that pullback shot I opened tonight with, the view of the Earth from space with the enormous chunk missing from it. The clearest confirmation the franchise ever offered that Ooo is our wounded planet. The second special, Obsidian, is the one centered on Marceline and Bubblegum as an established couple, and it is a gift to everyone who loved their romance. A story about the two of them returning to a place out of Marceline's past, working through old pain and old guilt, and choosing each other again as adults in a committed relationship. It deepens Marceline's history, fills in more of her long life, and treats the two of them with total seriousness as a couple, which is exactly the payoff the finale kiss promised. The third special, Together Again, is the one that reunites Finn and Jake, and it finally tells us how their story ends, far past the series finale, and it is devastating in the gentlest way. It reveals that Jake dies first, of old age, having lived a long, full life, and that Finn, older and alone, follows him into the afterlife, through the dead worlds, searching for his brother. And it uses that rule I told you about, the rule that the 50th dead world, the highest heaven, can only be reached by not wanting to reach it, and it pays that rule off, with the two brothers finding their way to peace together. Finn ultimately chooses reincarnation, chooses to go around again, to be born back into the world, and Jake chooses to follow him, so that even in death, even at the very end of everything, the two of them stay together and go on. It is the central promise kept one last time, that these two would never really be separated, not by death, not by anything. The fourth special, Wizard City, follows Peppermint Butler, the sinister little candy servant we met earlier, sending him back through a kind of reincarnation of his own into a wizard school, a lighter and more comedic entry that nonetheless keeps building out the corners of the world. Taken together, the Distant Land specials do what the series always did. They take the enormous history and find the intimate human, or robot, or vampire, or dog-scale story inside it, and they let us spend a little more time with people we were not ready to say goodbye to. And then, most recently, the franchise opened an entirely new door, one that reaches back into a piece of the show's own strange history fans had wondered about for years, and that door is Fiona and Cake. To understand Fiona and Cake, you have to remember a running joke from deep in the original series. Every so often, an episode would air in a gender-swapped version, in which all the characters appeared as opposite gender versions of themselves. Finn becoming a girl named Fiona, Jake becoming a cat named Cake, the Ice King becoming an Ice Queen, and so on. Within the story, these were framed as fan fiction written by the Ice King, silly tales the lonely wizard made up, a joke about a lonely man inventing a world where he was the hero. For years, that was all they were, a recurring gag. But the 2023 series Fiona and Cake takes that joke and gives it a stunning reframe. It reveals, through the return of Prismo, the wish-granting dream being from the time room, that the gender-swapped universe is real, an actual alternate reality Prismo secretly created, and it follows Fiona and Cake in that world as it comes under threat, while pulling in the now human Simon Petrikov from the main universe. Because Fiona and Cake is, at its heart, Simon's story, a continuation of the character whose tragedy has been the emotional spine of the whole franchise. It picks up the cured, human, grief-stricken Simon from after the finale, a man restored to himself but haunted, missing the powers and even the strange purpose the crown gave him, missing Betty, unsure how to live an ordinary mortal life after 1,000 years as something else. And it confronts him with the temptation to put the crown back on, to become the Ice King again, to escape the pain of being merely human. There is a piece of hard canon here worth stating clearly, because it matters for the whole meaning of his arc. Simon does not go back. Offered the crown, offered the return to power and oblivion, he refuses it. He chooses his human life, his grief and all, over the false comfort of the crown, and he discards it. After everything, after 1,000 years lost inside it, Simon Petrikov chooses to stay himself. That is the resolution the character always deserved and rarely looked likely to get, and the fact that the franchise came back years later specifically to give it to him tells you how much the people making it understood what he meant. The saddest character in the show finally gets to choose himself, and he does. Fiona and Cake also brings the multiverse fully into play. The idea that there are countless alternate Oos, countless versions of these characters, and it was renewed for a second season. So the history of the Land of Ooo is, as of now, still being written, still opening new rooms in a house that already seemed impossibly large, which is a good place to pause and pull all the settled facts together, all the things that cannot be undone, because in a franchise this big, with this many alternate versions and this much cosmic magic, it is easy to imagine anything could be reversed, that any door could be reopened, and that is not quite true. Some doors were closed on purpose, and closed for good, and knowing which ones is part of knowing the real shape of the history. Let me go through where everyone actually stands, because this is the part that trips people up, the part where fans want to imagine happy reversals that never came. Betty is gone. Not dead, exactly, but gone is Betty. She is fused into GOLB permanently, and the franchise has not undone it, and shows no sign of undoing it. When people say they hope Betty comes back to be with the cured Simon, they are hoping for something the story deliberately foreclosed, because the whole weight of her sacrifice depends on it being final. She gave herself up completely. That is the point. A Betty who could be easily restored would make her sacrifice mean nothing, and the writing was too honest for that. The Lich is not lurking out there as an active threat either, and this is one people forget. As the Lich, he is essentially finished. He is Sweet Pea now, a good child, his evil dormant and buried, and the old Lich never comes roaring back as the final boss the way you might expect a show to resurrect its devil. GOLB is the final cosmic threat of the finale, not the Lich, and even GOLB is not defeated by destruction, but by the song, by harmony. So when you picture the present state of Ooo, there is no Dark Lord scheming in a tower. There is a sweet boy who used to be death, growing up in a loving home, and that is one of the strangest and kindest facts in the whole franchise. Simon is human and staying human. I said it already, but it bears repeating, because it is the load-bearing fact of his whole arc. He does not become the Ice King again. Offered the crown in the newest series, he refuses it and discards it. The crown, meanwhile, sits on the head of Gunter the Penguin now, so the role of Ice King continues without Simon in it. Fern is dead and stays dead, but present in the far future as the great tree bearing the Finn sword, which is its own kind of continuation, a death that became a landmark. Martin, Finn's father, is gone from the earth entirely, having taken the purple comet's offer to leave, so there is no lingering hope of a warm reconciliation with him. That door is shut, the man simply left, which is about as Martin as an ending gets. Finn and Jake, crucially, do not die in the main series finale. They live on, and it is explicit through BMO's narration that they kept living their lives. Their deaths come much later, in the Distant Lands special that reunites them, Jake first of old age, and then Finn following him into the afterlife and choosing to be reborn. So if someone tells you Finn and Jake died at the end of the show, they are conflating the two, the series finale where the brothers survive, and the later special where, as very old versions of themselves, they finally pass on together. The distinction matters, because you were meant to leave the main finale knowing they got to keep living, that the reward for saving the world twice was an ordinary long life. The humans are not extinct, which we covered. The island civilization endures with Minerva watching over it. The elementals go on in their eternal cycle. Four forces always incarnate, always dying and returning. Prismo, killed by the Lich, is alive again, and appears in the newest series, because his dreamer was replaced. And the deep rule underneath all of it, the one the whole history keeps proving, is that in this universe you cannot truly erase what was, because memory outlasts magic, because a wish cannot override a witness who remembers, because even death is not an ending, but a passage through 50 worlds, toward a peace you can only reach by letting go. The Land of Ooo runs on the principle that things change and things stay, both at once, exactly like the lullaby a mother once sang to a little girl in the ruins. Nothing is permanent and nothing is truly lost. That is the physics of the place, dressed up as magic, and it is why it can be so sad and so hopeful in the same breath. Let me name one more load-bearing truth about the world before we step out of the story and into the story behind it, because it is the one that holds the whole history together. Everything in Ooo is downstream of the war. Every kingdom, every monster, every magical race, every strange power, traces back through 1,000 years to the day human beings nearly ended themselves, and to the mutagenic strangeness that day released. The Candy people are downstream of the war. Marceline's long grief is downstream of the war. Simon and the Crown found their terrible purpose in the aftermath of the war. Even the joy, especially the joy, is downstream of the war, because it grew in the crater the war left behind. Adventure Time looked at the worst thing our species is capable of and imagined, with enormous tenderness, what might still be worth loving on the far side of it. And to understand how a show like that came to exist at all, we have to step out of Ooo for a moment and look at the world it was actually made in, the real history behind the imaginary one, because that story has its own quiet drama, and it tells you a lot about why the whole thing feels the way it feels. Adventure Time began with one man and a 7-minute short. The creator is Pendleton Ward, and this was, remarkably, his first real animation job out of the California Institute of the Arts, the school that has produced a striking number of the people who reshaped American animation. Ward made a short film, around 7 minutes long, for a Frederator incubator program tied to Nickelodeon, and it aired on the Nicktoons network in early 2007, in January of that year. In that short, the hero is not yet called Finn, he is called Pen. And already the strange DNA of the whole thing is there. Pen and Jake rescuing Princess Bubblegum from the Ice King, a surreal detour involving Mars and Abraham Lincoln, that mix of sweetness and randomness and something a little melancholy underneath. The short went viral, in the way things went viral in those early days of internet video, racking up millions of views, and it built an audience out of pure word of mouth. There is a piece of the real history here I find almost funny in hindsight. Nickelodeon, which had the short, passed on it, twice. They looked at this thing a huge audience clearly loved and decided not to make it. It was Cartoon Network that saw what it had, and Cartoon Network greenlit a full series in the autumn of 2008. The series proper premiered in April of 2010, on the 5th, and from there it ran for 8 years, ending in September of 2018, on the 3rd. Across that run it produced 10 seasons and a great many episodes, the standard figure cited being around 283, though I will be honest that the exact count is a little slippery depending on how you tally the double-length specials, so it is safest to say well over 280 of them, most only 11 minutes long. That short length is part of the secret, by the way, because each episode was so brief, the writers could afford to be strange, to make one that was pure comedy, and then one that was pure heartbreak, and then one that quietly advanced the deep lore, without any single one having to carry the whole weight. The mythology I have spent tonight laying out was assembled out of hundreds of these little 11-minute pieces, a fragment here and a fragment there, which is why it took years to see the full shape, and why watching it back with the whole picture in mind feels like a different series. There is a real-world turning point in the middle of the run that I think you can feel in the storytelling itself, and it should be stated plainly and without gossip, because it is documented and it is human. Pendleton Ward, the creator, stepped down as showrunner during the 5th season. He did not leave. He stayed on as a storyboard artist and writer and voice actor, lending his voice to Lumpy Space Princess among others. But he handed over the day-to-day running of it, and he was open, publicly, about the reason being burnout, the sheer grinding exhaustion of running a production that large and that personal. He talked about it in interviews around 2014. The person who took over as showrunner was Adam Muto, who had been with the production a long time and who steered it through its most ambitious later seasons all the way to the end. I mention this not to pry into anyone's life, but because it is part of the honest history of the thing, that it was made by real people under real strain, that its creator loved it enough to protect himself by stepping back so it could keep going, and that the person who carried it home was someone who had grown up inside the production. The deepening of the lore, the miniseries, the bittersweet emotional swings of the later years, all of that happened under Muto's watch, built on the foundation Ward laid. The people who gave the characters their voices are worth naming too, because their performances are so much of why these people feel real. Finn is voiced by Jeremy Shada, who was a child when he started and grew up in the role right alongside the character, his own changing voice becoming part of Finn's aging. Jake is John DiMaggio, whose warm, gravelly delivery is inseparable from the character. Princess Bubblegum is Hynden Walsh. Marceline is Olivia Olson, and as I mentioned earlier, her father Hunson Abadir is played by her actual father, Martin Olson. A real family bond folded into a fictional one. The Ice King is Tom Kenny, who brings a heartbreaking vulnerability to a character who could have been just a joke. Bimo is Nikki Yang, who also voices Lady Rainicorn in the untranslated Korean, that gives that character her privacy. And the Lich, the voice of ancient death itself, is Ron Perlman, whose deep dread-filled tones make the embodiment of entropy sound exactly as final as it should. These performances, some of them running the better part of a decade, are a big part of why the emotional payoffs land, why you believe Simon under the Ice King and Bonnibel under the Princess. The series was also, by any measure, a critical triumph, and the recognition it received is part of its history. It won a large number of major awards, including a run of Primetime Emmy Awards, something like 8 or 9 of them across the franchise, along with a Peabody Award in 2014, an honor usually reserved for broadcasting's most substantial work, and various Annie Awards and British Academy Children's Awards, while its tie-in comics picked up an Eisner and Harvey Awards of their own. That level of recognition for something that began as a viral short about a boy named Penn that Nickelodeon passed on twice is its own kind of vindication, and the franchise extended beyond the main series into a whole shelf of other things. There were video games across the years, including one whose title is the kind of joke only this world would tell, a game called Hey Ice King, Why'd You Steal Our Garbage, released in 2012, followed by others, and eventually a larger adventure game named after the Enchiridion itself in 2018. There was a long-running comic book line, published under the Kaboom imprint of Boom Studios, that told its own stories in the world and was good enough to win an Eisner Award, the comic industry's highest honor, along with others, which is not a small thing for a licensed cartoon tie-in. And there were the continuations we have already walked through, the Distant Lands specials and the newest series, so that the world Ward dreamed up out of CalArts has now been alive, in one form or another, for the better part of 2 decades, told and retold across screens and pages by a small army of artists and writers who kept finding new corners of it worth exploring. For a show that started as a viral short a couple of studios did not want, that is a remarkable afterlife, and it is still going. I bring all of this real history in for a reason, and it connects back to everything we have talked about tonight, because the making of Adventure Time rhymes with the story Adventure Time tells. It is a story about something small and strange and made with love, a 7-minute short by a young artist, growing into something enormous and lasting, passing from hand to hand, changing as it went, surviving the exhaustion and the transitions and the years, and reaching a whole generation who carried it forward. It is a story about the thing you make out living, the moment you made it in, about a creation taking on a life beyond its creator, about memory and continuation, which is exactly what it is about inside its own fiction. BMO telling the story 1,000 years on, so Finn and Jake will not be forgotten. The show and its making are the same shape. Something tender was built in the shadow of hard times, and it grew, and it stayed, and it changed, and it is still going. That is the history of the Land of Ooo, and it is also the history of the show about the Land of Ooo, and I do not think that rhyme is an accident. I think it is what happens when the people making a thing actually mean it. If you step back from the whole history now, from the comets to the far future tree, one pattern rises up out of it that I think is the real subject underneath the adventures and the magic, and it is this. Ooo is a world of children left to clean up after their parents. That is the shape of nearly every story we have walked through tonight. The oldest parent of all is humanity itself, our whole species, which built the bombs and fought the war, and handed its children a poisoned and broken planet, and every single being in Ooo is, in a sense, a child of that abandonment, born into a world their ancestors ruined and never asked to inherit. And then the pattern repeats, over and over, down at the human scale, generation after generation of parents failing their children, and children having to survive it and, if they are lucky, do better. Marceline was left by a father who chose his kingdom over her, and shaped by a mother she lost too soon, and cared for, in the gap, by a man who then forgot her. Bubblegum built herself a family out of loneliness, and had to unmake the uncle who turned on her, carrying that betrayal in silence for centuries. Flame Princess had a cruel father who imprisoned and belittled her, and she had to overthrow him to become something better than he was. Finn spent his whole life aching for the human parents he never had, only to find a father who abandoned him twice, and a mother who could only reach him as an echo in a machine. Even Jake, gentle, scattered Jake, half raises his own children by accident and watches them grow up faster than he can parent them, doing his loving best and falling short in the ordinary ways. The whole world is full of damaged inheritances, of young beings handed the wreckage of the ones who came before, and it looks at all of it without flinching. What moves me about the answer to that, because there is an answer, is that it is not that the cycle is unbreakable. The answer is that you get to choose what you do with the wreckage. Finn, offered his father's path of endless escape, chooses to stay and be present. Simon, offered the crown that would let him flee his own grief, chooses to remain a mortal human and feel it. Marceline, offered the chance to cut away the painful parts of herself, chooses to remain whole. Bubblegum chooses, in the end, to let her people have freedom and to let Marceline close instead of controlling everything. Over and over, the characters are put in front of the exact door their parents walked through, the door marked escape or power or control or forgetting. And over, the ones who grow choose the harder door instead, the one marked stay and feel and remember and love. The children of Ooo do not get unbroken childhoods. What they get is the chance to be better ancestors than the ones they had, and that chance is treated as something close to sacred. That is why the far future ending lands the way it does, with new children finding old artifacts and an ancient voice telling them where it all came from. Because the whole thing has been about inheritance, about what gets passed down, the good and the terrible both, and the ending is a deliberate choice to pass down the good. Bimo does not tell Shermie and Beth the story to burden them. Bimo tells it so they will know they are loved, so they will know the world they were born into was made by people who cared, so the inheritance they receive is not just a poisoned planet, but a story worth carrying. The tree from Fern's seed still stands, the sword is remade. The lullaby about how everything stays and everything changes is still, somewhere, true. And the children pick up the old arm in the grass and they are curious, not afraid, which is as hopeful an image as it could possibly end on. The wreckage becomes an artifact. The grief becomes a story. The war becomes a garden. That is the entire history of the Land of Ooo, from the first comet to the last child, and it is, when you hold all of it at once, about as generous a thing as anyone ever put on a screen for children. I have spent a lot of tonight on the sadness, because the sadness is real, and it never pretended otherwise, but I do not want to leave you there, because the story does not leave you there. It leaves you in a green field 1,000 years on, with 2 curious kids and an old friend who remembers, and the sun coming up. Adventure Time looked at the collapse of the world and decided to tell a story about everything that comes after, and it decided that everything after was worth it. That is the note it ends on, and before we drift toward it, there is one last thread I want to follow, because it runs from the deep past straight into Finn himself, and it is one of the stranger and more beautiful pieces of the whole design. The thread is reincarnation, and Finn's soul, and the way his story ties back to the entire span of the world through a chain of past lives. Because Finn, it turns out, is not a new soul. He is the latest body for a soul that has lived many times across the ages of Ooo, and this comes out slowly, through fragments, the way everything does. The clearest piece comes in a 5th season episode called The Vault, in which Finn experiences memories that are not his own, memories of a past life as a thief named Shoko. Shoko lived in the early days of the Candy Kingdom, long before Finn was born, and she was a one-armed thief, missing an arm, a detail that hits differently once you remember Finn himself will later lose an arm at the Citadel. Shoko took a job that brought her into contact with the young Princess Bubblegum, and there was a chance at friendship there, a chance at being something better than a thief, and it went wrong, and Shoko died, and she died beside a small sapling, a little tree just beginning to grow, and her body and her soul passed into the ground there, and that sapling, over the centuries, grew into the great tree Finn and Jake would one day live inside, the treehouse. Finn lives in the tree that grew where his own past life died. He was, in the deepest sense, always going to end up there. His home is his own grave from a life before. I find that almost unbearably elegant, the way a hero's origin gets buried 1,000 years deep and left for you to find by accident. And it connects to the swords, because the Finn sword, the sentient blade born from a time paradox, is tied to this same reincarnated soul, an object that carries Finn's essence across time the way the tree does. And it connects to the 4th comet, the purple one, the Catalyst Comet that arrived after the war carrying an incarnation of Finn's soul, the comet that offered him the chance to ascend and leave the cycle, which he refused, choosing instead to stay in the world and keep being reborn into it. Finn's soul has been part of Oo's history for its entire span, a thief in the early kingdom, a body offered a comet, a boy in a tree that grew from his own death, and at the very end, in the far future, perhaps a new child named Shermie finding an old arm in the grass, though that last one is left as a whisper rather than a statement, and so will I. The point is that Finn is not separate from the history of Ooo. He is woven into it at the level of the soul, one thread pulled through the whole 1,000 years, dying and returning and dying and returning, always drawn back to the same tree, the same kingdom, the same work of trying to be good in a broken world. And that, more than anything, is why it can end on hope without feeling like a cheat. Because the history of Ooo is not a straight line from disaster to disaster. It is a cycle, a wheel, comets and elementals and souls all turning, dying and living again. And the story trusts the wheel. It trusts that life comes back, that the good soul gets another life, that the tree grows from the grave, that the child will find the arm in the grass and be curious rather than afraid. The war was real, and the grief was real, and the losses do not get undone. And still the wheel turns, and still something new grows in the crater, and still, 1,000 years on, there is someone left to tell the story, and someone new to hear it. That is the whole history of the Land of Ooo, from the first spark of life on a barren planet, to a green field under a rising sun, and I think few cartoons ever built an imaginary history this complete or this tender. So as you lie there, somewhere in the quiet of the night, let me leave you with the shape of the whole thing one more time, gently, the way you might set a book down on the nightstand before the light goes off. A barren planet, and a comet that brought it life. An age of dinosaurs, and an ice wizard who built a crown to fight the darkness coming for them. A crown that would outlive him by tens of millions of years. The slow rise of us, the human race, the third comet's gift, clever enough to build wonders, and clever enough to build the bombs that ended everything. A kind man and the woman he loved, and the cursed thing that took his mind. A war of mushroom clouds, and a piece of the world torn away. And then, in the ashes, the beginning again. A little girl, and the stuffed bear that meant she was loved. A princess made of candy, building a kingdom out of the wreckage. A vampire queen with 1,000 years of songs in her. Heroes and monsters and elementals, and a boy who thought he was the last of his kind, and was only ever the lost one. And at the far end of all of it, a green field, and 2 curious children, and an old friend who remembered, so none of it would be forgotten. Adventure Time arrived, looking like a silly little cartoon about a kid and a talking dog, and it left as one of the best-loved and most influential works of animation of its whole era. A series that showed an entire generation of storytellers you could put real grief and real philosophy and real love into a cartoon and trust children to meet you there. It changed what people thought children's animation was allowed to be, and you can see its fingerprints on almost everything thoughtful that came after it. The shows that trusted their young audiences with grief and wonder and hard questions, because Adventure Time proved there was a hunger for exactly that and an audience ready to meet it. And it did all of it while never once losing its sweetness, never becoming grim for the sake of it, always coming back to the idea that connection is what saves us and memory is what lasts. That is a rare thing to make, and rarer still to make well, and I do not think we will see many like it again. If you have been drifting in and out for the last little while, that is exactly right. That is what this is for. You do not need to remember every comet or every kingdom. You only need to know that the world ended once and life came back anyway, and that a show once told that story with more tenderness than anyone expected, and that you got to fall asleep inside it tonight. Let the Land of Ooo keep turning while you rest. It has been turning for a very long time, and it does not need you to stay awake for it to keep going. Thank you for spending this long, quiet stretch of the night here with me. It genuinely means a lot that you choose these to fall asleep to. If you enjoyed the video, make sure to subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.